I have this theory about romantic chemistry. Not the deep, soul-aching kind you see in epic novels, but the fluttery, awkward, wait, do they like me back kind. It's this, everyone has a personal love language, but mine is highly specific. I flirt by offering people ridiculously unnecessary life advice. Like if I have a crush on you, you're probably going to hear me say something insane like, if you keep your toaster unplugged when you're not using it, your bread tastes better. And no, I don't know why I do this. I call it my unsolicited wisdom approach. It's not a strategy, I want to be clear about that. It's more like a reflex. Something about liking someone seems to short-circuit my ability to have normal conversations. And instead of saying, hey, you look great today, I'll blurt out, if you hum happy birthday while washing your hands, it kills 99.9% of germs. Which, now that I think about it, sounds less like flirting and more like I'm auditioning to be a quirky public service announcement. There's this guy at work, let's call him Liam, who unwittingly became the main target of my affection and, by extension, my unsolicited advice campaign. Liam works in IT, so his whole vibe is a mix of mysterious competence, and I've seen every episode of The X-Files. The first time we talked, I felt this weird urge to impress him, and instead of saying anything remotely charming, I panicked and said, you know, if you restart your router every month, your Wi-Fi runs smoother. He blinked at me, then said, cool, I'll keep that in mind, and walked off. Now, a normal person would have taken this as a sign to reel it in. But did I stop? Of course not. A few days later, we ended up in the break room together. He was making tea, and I saw my opportunity. I pointed at the mug in his hand and said, if you steep green tea for too long, it turns bitter because of the tannins. He raised an eyebrow and said, thanks, Mom. Mom, he was teasing me, and instead of dying on the spot like a sane person, my brain went, he's engaging. He's interested. Deploy more facts. The thing about my advice flirting is that I can't turn it off once it starts. It's like a faucet stuck on full blast. One time I even tried to prepare something ahead of time, something cute and pre-approved. But the moment I was face-to-face with Liam, my brain threw my script out the window, and I ended up saying, if you freeze grapes, they're like nature's popsicles. He smiled, which I took as encouragement, even though, looking back, it might have just been polite bewilderment. But hey, it worked because a week later, he told me, I tried the grape thing. You're right. They're amazing. And I swear, my heart nearly exploded. Now, if this were a rom-com, this would be the part where Liam secretly confesses that he's into me too, and we share some big climactic moment involving frozen grapes and Wi-Fi routers. But life isn't a rom-com. Life is messy and weird. Case in point, last Friday, I accidentally walked into a meeting I wasn't supposed to be in because I saw Liam through the glass and assumed it was casual hangout time. Everyone stared at me while I awkwardly backed out, muttering something about checking the fire extinguishers because you never know when they'll expire. To his credit, Liam didn't laugh, or at least not until I was out of earshot. Later, when I passed him in the hall, he grinned and said, thanks for keeping us safe, safety officer. And maybe I imagined it, but I swear there was a little bit of warmth in the teasing, like he was starting to figure me out and didn't hate it. I guess my quirk, if we're being generous, is that I'm constantly inventing these strange little worlds where liking someone means leaving a trail of bizarre, completely impractical advice, like breadcrumbs. And sure, it's awkward, but it's also kind of sweet. Like, maybe I don't know how to say, I think you're wonderful, but offering you tips for fresher bread or smoother Wi-Fi feels like a love letter only I could write. So now I want to know, do you have any weird habits when it comes to crushes or dating? Please tell me I'm not the only one whose flirting style could double as a survival guide to random trivia. Let's start a new story. I woke up to the sound of laughter, a deep, rolling chuckle that came from somewhere near the foot of my bed. For one panicked second, I thought someone had broken in, but when I sat up, I realized the laughter was coming from my dresser. It had grown a face overnight, kindly, wrinkled, and vaguely reminiscent of a grandfather who tells the same joke every Thanksgiving. Good morning, champ, the dresser said, its voice creaking like an old rocking chair. Ready to face the day? I stared at it for a long moment, then decided I wasn't quite ready to question the nature of reality before coffee. Sure, I said, swinging my legs out of bed. The dresser beamed, The kind of expression that made its top drawer slide open just a little in what might have been delight. "Attaboy," it said. The window was glowing, but not in the way windows usually do. The light outside wasn't sunlight exactly. It was too fluid, like liquid gold spilling over the glass. When I touched the pane, it rippled under my fingers, soft and warm. I pushed the window open and was hit with the smell of burnt marshmallows and something else. Peaches, maybe? A breeze rolled in, curling itself around me like a curious cat. It murmured, "There's something waiting for you," before slipping back out again. Outside, the street was different. The houses were still there, but they weren't behaving like houses. One yawned, its windows stretching wide as shutters flapped lazily. Another had sprouted flowers along its roof, tiny blossoms that pulsed with a soft light. The street itself wasn't straight anymore. It twisted gently, curling into a loose spiral that led down to what I can only describe as a meadow that hadn't existed yesterday. I decided to follow the spiral because, really, what else do you do in a situation like this? The sidewalk hummed under my feet, a low, steady vibration that seemed to sync up with my heartbeat. As I walked, a lamppost leaned down to my level. Its bulb flickered once, twice, then settled into a warm glow. "Looking sharp," it said. "Thanks," I replied, because what's the point of manners if you don't use them? The meadow at the end of the spiral was a riot of color. Flowers that looked like they'd been dreamed into existence, their petals shifting shapes as if they couldn't decide on a final form. A path wound through the meadow, made of stones that glimmered like wet ink. As I stepped onto it, the stones whispered beneath me, their voices overlapping like a choir. "Go on," they said. "You're almost there." "Almost where?" I asked, but the stones didn't answer. They were stones, after all. They probably had better things to do. At the end of the path stood a tree, massive, ancient, and impossibly alive. Its bark shimmered, not like wood, but like the surface of a deep, dark lake under a full moon. Its branches stretched high into the sky, where they dissolved into clouds that twisted and coiled like smoke. Sitting at the base of the tree was a fox. Not an ordinary fox, mind you. This one wore a waistcoat and had a small monocle perched on the end of its nose. "Finally," said the fox, adjusting its monocle. "I've been waiting all morning." "For what?" I asked, half expecting it to scold me for being late. "For you, of course," it said, as though that were the most obvious answer in the world. "We've got a mystery to solve." "We do." "We do," the fox said. "But first tea." The fox snapped its fingers, or would have if foxes had fingers. Instead, it made a sharp clicking sound, and suddenly there was a table between us, laden with a tea set that looked like it had been borrowed from a particularly whimsical dream. The tea poured itself into a cup and floated gently to my hand. When I sipped it, it tasted like nostalgia, like summer evenings and the smell of rain on pavement. "All right," the fox said, leaning forward with an intensity that made its monocle wobble. "The world has been rearranging itself." "I noticed," I said. "And it's not random," the fox continued. "It's deliberate, a reorganization, and I need your help to figure out why." "Why me?" The fox smiled a sharp, knowing grin. "Why not?" Before I could respond, the tree behind the fox groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the air itself. The bark rippled, and from the ripples emerged a door, its surface carved with symbols that glowed faintly. "Ah," said the fox, standing up and brushing non-existent dust off its waistcoat. "There's your first clue. Shall we?" I looked at the door, then back at the fox. I had 100 questions, but none of them seemed important compared to the strange, magnetic pull of the glowing door. So, I followed the fox. The door opened with a sound like falling stars, and the world beyond it wasn't a world at all. It was a canvas, blank and waiting. The fox stepped through, its tail swishing in a way that might have been beckoning. "This," it said, "is where things begin." And then it turned to me, eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite name. "The question is," it said, "how do you want it to end?" So, here's the question I'll leave you with. If the world handed you a blank canvas, if everything you thought was fixed and certain was suddenly soft and malleable, what would you create? What story would you paint into existence? Because, as it turns out, the rules are entirely up to you. Let's start a new story. This morning, I woke up to the sound of my alarm, which wasn't unusual, except that it was a rooster. Not the annoying neighbor's rooster or some alarm app designed to simulate farm life. No, there was an actual, feathered, slightly judgmental rooster standing on my bedside table, pecking at my phone like it was trying to snooze the world. Before I could process what was happening, the rooster cocked its head at me, squawked something that sounded vaguely like about time, and hopped onto the floor. Here's where it got weirder. Instead of my usual carpet, my feet landed on moss. Moss! My entire room was gone, replaced by what looked like the inside of an enchanted forest. Think, giant mushrooms glowing faintly, vines hanging down like they'd taken a casual stroll from the ceiling, an air that smelled faintly of citrus and secrets. The rooster strutted out the door, which was now an arch made of ivy, leaving me standing there in my mismatched pajamas and trying to decide if this was a dream or just Wednesday. I followed, of course, because when your room disappears and a rooster seems to know what's up, you don't argue. Outside, I found myself on a dirt path that shimmered slightly, like someone had dusted it with glitter for dramatic effect. And standing there, waiting for me, was well, I guess you'd call it a knight? It was about 3 feet tall, made entirely of wood, and had a face that looked suspiciously like the smiley emoji. It also carried a sword made of some kind of crystal, which seemed impractical but undeniably cool. Ah, the chosen one has arrived, the wooden knight said in a voice like a violin string being plucked. It bowed, which was honestly impressive given the whole rigid wooden limbs situation. We have much to do. Chosen for what? I asked, still trying to figure out if I'd hit my head on something during the night. To save the kingdom, of course. It replied, like this was the most obvious thing in the world. The stars foretold your arrival. They also mentioned something about mismatched socks, so you're clearly the one. It gestured to my feet, where one sock was neon orange, and the other had little pandas on it. Great. Destiny has a sense of humor. I wanted to protest. I'm not exactly hero material. My fitness level peaks at opening stubborn jars, and my greatest battle so far has been with customer service. But the wooden knight was already marching down the path, and the rooster gave me a look that said, "Are you coming, or what?" So I followed. The forest was alive in a way that felt almost too alive. Trees shifted their branches to let us pass, and I swear one of them whispered, "Good luck, kid." A stream we crossed played music as its water trickled over rocks. A cheerful little melody that would have been delightful if I weren't so busy wondering if I'd fallen into a Disney movie. Along the way, the wooden knight explained that an ancient artifact called the Orb of Whimsy had been stolen by a nefarious being of immense power. The kingdom had been plunged into chaos without it. Rain now fell upward, cats barked, and cheese refused to melt. So, the fate of the world depends on whimsy? I asked, trying not to laugh because it seemed rude. Precisely, said the knight, as if this made perfect sense. Without whimsy, everything unravels. The mundane takes over. Imagine spreadsheets without doodles in the margins. Songs sung with no rhymes. Games played without fun. I shuddered. Point made. When we reached the edge of the forest, we were greeted by a peculiar sight. A gigantic marshmallow castle, shimmering in the sunlight. Its walls were squishy and slightly sticky, and the moat appeared to be filled with what I could only describe as swirling rivers of hot chocolate. Guarding the drawbridge was the nefarious being in question, a goat. But not just any goat. This goat wore a crown and an expression that said it had seen some things and come out stronger for it. It also had a massive spoon strapped to its back. "This is the great goat of gloom," the knight whispered, though the goat was clearly within earshot. "Beware its sharp wit and devastating critiques." The goat snorted, then bleated. "Oh, please. You think I'm nefarious? I just wanted the orb because it's shiny and I like shiny things." It swished its tail and added, "Also, the kingdom didn't even notice it was missing for 3 months. Hardly a great loss. Return the orb, foul beast," the wooden knight declared, raising its crystal sword dramatically. The goat yawned. Foul beast? I'm literally a goat, it said, in the tone of someone who's over this whole heroic nonsense. You want the orb? Fine, but only if you can answer my riddle. The riddle was surprisingly simple. What has two ends but no beginning? The knight froze, its wooden brain apparently struggling with this one. I took a wild guess and said, a piece of string? The goat's eyes widened. How did you? Yes, correct. It grudgingly handed over the orb of whimsy, which looked like a giant snow globe filled with glitter and tiny floating ducks. Take it and go, but don't come back. You're all so dramatic. We returned the orb to the kingdom, and immediately everything started to return to normal, or as normal as a place full of talking trees and musical streams could be. The king, who was a literal dandelion with a tiny crown, threw a feast in my honor, complete with confetti made of flower petals and a cake that somehow tasted like happiness itself. The rooster, now looking smug, perched on my shoulder like it had orchestrated the whole thing. When I woke up back in my bed, there was no moss, no forest, and no rooster. Just my phone buzzing with emails and the faint smell of coffee from the kitchen. But on my bedside table was a single feather, golden and faintly shimmering, and a tiny wooden figurine of a knight, smiling emoji face and all. So now I have to ask, if you were thrust into a world where whimsy itself was at stake, what would you do? Would you face the great goat of gloom, or just stay in the forest and vibe with the musical streams? Be honest. Let's start a new story. I was cutting through the alley behind the hardware store on my way home from the post office. It was a shortcut I'd taken 100 times, past the same faded graffiti and the dumpsters that always smelled faintly of old produce. I wasn't thinking about anything important, just the usual. What I'd make for dinner, if I remembered to pay the electric bill, whether I had time to squeeze in a run. Then the scent hit me, a warm, sweet, almost buttery smell that stopped me dead in my tracks. I couldn't place it at first. It was faint, carried on a gust of wind that disappeared as quickly as it came. But for the few seconds it lingered, my brain was flooded with a feeling so visceral it was almost disorienting. A strange mix of comfort and longing, like stumbling across a song you hadn't heard in years but still knew every word to. I stood there, sniffing the air like an idiot, waiting for the scent to return. When it did, I realized what it was: waffle cones. Freshly made, the kind that are pressed into shape while still warm and smell like golden brown happiness. Now, here's the thing. I hadn't thought about waffle cones in years. Probably decades. They were just one of those small joys that had faded quietly into the background of adulthood. But in that moment, they came roaring back into focus, bringing a tidal wave of memories with them. I was 9 years old again, standing in the tiny ice cream parlor that used to sit at the corner of Maple and Fifth. It was called Joe's, though no one ever called it that. We just called it the ice cream place. The counters were sticky, the ceiling fans wobbled dangerously, and the floor tiles were chipped and mismatched, but none of that mattered. Joe's had the best waffle cones in the world, made right there behind the counter by a man with arms like tree trunks and a laugh so loud it shook the walls. I could see it all so clearly. The way the steam curled up from the waffle iron, the way the whole place smelled like sugar and joy, the way I used to stand on tiptoe to watch Joe work. He'd wink at me when he caught me staring, and if I was lucky, he'd hand me a broken cone for free, wrapped in a piece of wax paper. For quality control, he'd say, as if I were some kind of expert. I don't even remember what my favorite ice cream flavor was back then. Probably something embarrassingly bright and artificial like blue raspberry or bubblegum. But the cone? That was the real prize. The crispy edges, the soft center, the way it tasted just as good by itself as it did with ice cream dripping down the sides. I hadn't thought about Joe's in forever. The place had shut down when I was a teenager, replaced by a chain coffee shop that somehow managed to feel both sterile and pretentious at the same time. I'd driven past it 1,000,000 times since then without giving it a second thought. But now, standing there in that dingy alley with the smell of waffle cones hanging in the air, I felt like I was back in that tiny shop, 9 years old, and utterly convinced that life would always be this simple. The smell faded again, leaving me standing there in a strange daze. I was about to write it off as some random bakery nearby when I saw it. A tiny food cart parked at the edge of the alley, with a hand-painted sign that said Marley's Cones. There was no way this was real. No way the universe had just plucked a memory out of my childhood and dropped it in front of me. But it was. I walked over slowly, half convinced that the cart would vanish the moment I got too close. Behind it stood a woman about my age, wearing a yellow apron dusted with flour. She was turning a cone on one of those old-fashioned molds, and the sight of it nearly broke me. I felt like I'd stumbled into some alternate reality where childhood never ended. "Hey there," she said brightly, noticing me staring. "Want a cone?" I nodded, unable to find my voice. She handed me one, a plain waffle cone, warm and perfectly golden. I didn't even ask about the price. I just handed her a $5 bill and took the cone like it was the most precious thing in the world. I bit into it, and time folded in on itself. It tasted exactly like I remembered, buttery sweet with just a hint of vanilla. For a few blissful seconds, I wasn't standing in an alley in the middle of a cold, gray city. I was back in Joe's, sitting on a plastic chair with my legs swinging, not a care in the world. "It's good, huh?" the woman said, pulling me back to the present. "Yeah," I said softly, my voice thick with something I couldn't quite name. "It's perfect." She smiled, and for a moment, it felt like she knew. Like she could see the memories swirling around me, all the tiny fragments of my childhood coming back to life. I stood there for a while, finishing the cone and soaking in the moment. When I finally walked away, I felt lighter, like some invisible weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't just about the waffle cone. It was about remembering a version of myself I hadn't thought about in years. A version that believed in magic and simple joys and the possibility that every day held something special. As I turned the corner and headed home, I glanced back at the cart. It was still there, the woman humming softly as she worked. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that if I came back tomorrow, it might not be. Sometimes, I think the universe has a strange way of reminding us of the things we've forgotten. Little moments that crack open the shell of adulthood and let the light in. What about you? Has anything ever yanked you back to a memory you didn't even know you still had? Let's start a new story. I noticed something the other day that made me pause in the middle of my coffee shop people-watching routine. A man in his late 40s, wearing a suit that had seen better days, sat down across from a woman, maybe in her 30s, holding a laptop covered in colorful stickers. They didn't know each other, at least not yet. She looked up, noticed him fumbling with his phone, and said something I couldn't hear over the cafe chatter. He tilted his head in that way people do when they're a little lost. She gestured toward his phone and, in a series of quick, fluid motions, reached across the table to help him. I thought she might be showing him directions or maybe helping him figure out a setting. But as it turns out, she was teaching him how to send a Venmo request. "You just tap here," I caught her saying with a little laugh. "And now your roommate can't pretend they forgot about the rent." He laughed too, though it was the nervous laugh of someone suddenly aware of the vast gulf between himself and the person sitting opposite. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. She stayed, explaining with all the patience of someone showing their dad how to text for the first time. By the time she left, he was grinning down at his phone like a kid who just solved his first math problem. That interaction stuck with me. It wasn't just the kindness of it, though that was lovely. It was the unspoken understanding between them. This small, shared moment where two entirely different worlds collided and left both people a little better for it. It got me thinking about how much of modern life works like that now. These unexpected exchanges of knowledge, humor, or support that unfold between complete strangers. Take memes, for example. Memes are this bizarre, ever-evolving language that everyone seems to speak a little differently. Yet somehow they connect us. I saw one last week that was just a picture of a raccoon holding a slice of pizza with the caption, "Me at 2 a.m. making choices." That was it. No context, no story. And yet, it felt like a universal truth. The comments were a goldmine too. People riffing off the raccoon, confessing their own midnight snack crimes, sharing recipes for 2-ingredient pizza dough. It was chaos, but the good kind. The kind that makes you feel like the whole world is just a little less lonely. Or take online reviews. I know, That sounds boring, but hear me out. Have you ever fallen into the rabbit hole of reading reviews for something mundane, like a broom? I did once, and it was an accidental masterpiece. Someone had written an entire novella about their love for this broom, complete with dramatic prose about its sweeping power. Another reviewer disagreed, claiming their broom was defective and calling it the Judas of cleaning supplies. It's ridiculous, sure, but it's also this strange, collective act of storytelling. We don't just want to rate things anymore. We want to entertain each other in the process. Even how we handle failure has changed. I've seen people post videos of their cooking disasters, burnt pancakes, collapsed soufflés with captions like, "Nailed it." It's not self-deprecation exactly. It's more like self-acceptance, maybe? Like we've decided it's okay to laugh at ourselves as long as we're in on the joke. One of my favorite videos was this guy trying to make a loaf of bread from scratch. He started confident, ended up with something that looked more like a football, and then just turned it into a skit about his bread child being rejected by its yeast ancestors. The comments were full of people not only laughing with him, but also sharing their own bread fails. One person wrote, "My first loaf looked like a meteorite. I still ate it." That level of camaraderie makes you feel like you're part of something bigger, even if it's just a global club of bad bakers. And it's not just online. The other day, I was walking through the park, and I saw a group of strangers gathered around one guy with a frisbee stuck in a tree. One woman offered to throw her water bottle to knock it down. A guy with a dog suggested sending the dog to retrieve it, even though the physics of that plan were questionable at best. Finally, an older man walked up with a collapsible cane, extended it, and poked the frisbee free. Everyone cheered like they just won a championship game. It wasn't about the frisbee. It was about this small, collective effort to solve a silly problem. I walked away feeling lighter, like I'd stumbled into a moment of pure, uncomplicated humanity. The beauty of all this is how unpolished it is. There's no script, no agenda, just a bunch of people fumbling toward connection in their own weird ways. A stranger helps you learn an app. A meme makes you laugh on a bad day. A group of people unites over a stuck frisbee. These little interactions aren't flashy or Instagram perfect, but they're real. They're the moments that remind us we're all just people trying to figure it out as we go. So now I have to ask, have you ever noticed something about the way people connect today that makes you pause and smile? Something small, something weird, but so wonderfully human it sticks with you? Let's start a new story. The plan was simple. Drive up the coast, find a quiet beach, and spend the weekend reading a book I'd been trying to finish for months. But simple plans have a way of unraveling, and mine started to come apart just before sunset on a winding road that hugged the cliffs. The sun was dipping low, painting the water in liquid gold, when I saw the figure in the middle of the road. It was a man waving frantically, his silhouette backlit by the fading light. I slowed, instinctively locking my doors as I pulled over. He jogged up to the passenger side window, breathless and apologetic. He looked to be in his 30s, with messy hair and a face that seemed permanently on the verge of laughter, even now. "Sorry," he said, "but I need a ride. My friend's stuck at the bottom of the cove, and my car just stopped working." The smart thing would have been to say no. But there was something about the way he spoke, like he couldn't quite believe he was in this situation either, that made me nod. I told him to hop in, and he did, smelling faintly of salt and campfire smoke. "My name's Jonah," he said as we drove. He pointed ahead. "Just around that bend. You're a lifesaver." We reached a turnout where a narrow dirt trail led down to the water. Jonah jumped out and motioned for me to follow. I hesitated, glancing at my book on the passenger seat, but curiosity won. I killed the engine, grabbed my jacket, and followed him down the path. The trail was steep and overgrown, and I nearly twisted my ankle twice. "Is your friend okay?" I asked as I stumbled after him. "Yeah," Jonas said over his shoulder. "Just stuck." "Stuck how?" "You'll see." Not exactly reassuring. When we reached the bottom, I stopped in my tracks. The cove was stunning, a hidden pocket of rocky shore framed by jagged cliffs. The ocean shimmered under the rising moon, and the air was cool and salty. But that wasn't what caught my attention. A boat, a small, beat-up rowboat, was wedged between two massive rocks, half in the water and half out. Perched on the bow, waving like she was trying to flag down a passing plane, was a woman in a bright yellow raincoat. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and she looked as furious as she was ridiculous. "About time," she yelled. "I've been yelling for hours." "This is my sister, Lila," Jonah said, grinning sheepishly. "I'm not your sister," she snapped, jumping down from the boat. "I'm your accomplice." "Big difference." I raised an eyebrow. "Accomplice?" Jonah looked suddenly interested in the ground. Lila, however, had no such hesitation. "We were trying to map out a shipwreck," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Jonah thinks he saw something on an old nautical chart. Treasure, maybe, or just some junk. Either way, I ended up in that," she said, pointing at the boat. "And he abandoned me for, 2 hours." "I didn't abandon you," Jonah protested. "The car broke down." Lila rolled her eyes. "Convenient." At this point, I had 1,000 questions, but before I could ask any of them, Jonah clapped his hands together. "All right," he said, "let's get the boat unstuck." It turned out to be a team effort. Jonah and I pushed while Lila barked orders from inside the boat. At one point, a wave soaked all 3 of us, and Lila dissolved in a laughter so contagious I couldn't help but join in. Eventually, we freed the boat and dragged it up the shore, where it rested like a tired old dog. By then, the moon was high, and I realized I was shivering. Jonah rummaged through his bag and pulled out a slightly crushed thermos, which he handed to me. It was coffee, strong and surprisingly good. Lila built a small fire, and we sat around it, drying off and watching the waves. They told me about their project, which sounded more like a wild goose chase than an actual plan. Jonah had a knack for finding forgotten places on maps, old mines, hidden trails, and apparently shipwrecks. Lila was his reluctant partner, drawn in by the promise of adventure and the chance to mock him mercilessly. "I can't believe you stopped for him," Lila said, nudging me with her elbow. "You know how sketchy that sounds, right? A guy waving you down on a deserted road?" "She's got a point," Jonah admitted. "Thanks for not calling the cops." "I thought about it," I said, grinning. "Still might." We stayed there longer than I'd planned, swapping stories and listening to the crackle of the fire. At some point, Jonah pulled out a harmonica and played a few notes, just enough to make Lila groan and pretend to throw a rock at him. For a moment, it felt like we'd all known each other forever. When the fire died down, Jonah walked me back up the trail to my car. The engine turned over on the first try, and I felt a strange pang of disappointment. "You should come back sometime," Jonah said. "We're planning to check out another cove next weekend." "Does that one come with a stuck boat and a yelling accomplice?" I asked. "Probably," he said with a laugh. I drove away, the coffee thermos warming my hands and the smell of salt lingering in my hair. It wasn't until I got home that I realized I never finished my book. But somehow, that didn't bother me. Have you ever stumbled into a moment so unexpected it felt like you'd stepped into someone else's story? Let's start a new story. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was that my blanket was humming to itself. A soft, melodic tune, not bad, honestly, like something a grandmother might sing while knitting. At first, I thought it was just my phone playing a song, but when I shifted, the blanket sighed and muttered, "Morning already? You're like a furnace in the night. You know that?" I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and sat up. My pillow grumbled, "Easy, champ. You've been crushing me for hours, and I'd like a breather." I stared at it. The pillow looked as innocent as ever, but the voice was there, clear as day, low and gruff, like it had been a chain smoker in a past life. My first coherent thought was, okay, this is definitely a dream. My second thought was, does my pillow sound like a retired mob boss? I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, and my slippers squealed in unison. Whoa, whoa. Cold feet alert. A little warning next time, huh? They shuffled themselves slightly under my toes, muttering something about thankless jobs. In the hallway, my mirror whispered, "Looking a little rough, aren't we?" I shot at a glare. It didn't apologize. By the time I stumbled into the kitchen, I was fully convinced that either the entire universe had decided to prank me, or I developed some sort of hyperspecific psychosis. My coffee machine beeped cheerfully and said, "Oh, you're gonna need me today. Double shot? Triple? Let's go wild." I nodded weakly. and it went about its business, whistling like a construction worker while it brewed. But then my toast. Oh, my toast. The toaster popped it out with a dramatic tada, and the bread itself chimed in. Don't you dare butter me. I'm perfect as I am. I froze, knife in hand, staring at the audacious slice. It scoffed. Typical. Can't let me shine? Can you? Always with the toppings. I decided I wasn't ready for breakfast. As I sat at my kitchen table, dazed and sipping coffee, which, thankfully, hadn't developed a personality, my fridge clicked open and shouted, "Hey, just a heads up, your lettuce is wilting and the milk's about to turn. You might want to handle that before I start smelling like regret." I took a deep breath. "Okay," I said aloud. "Why is this happening?" "Maybe you've finally started listening," my chair said, creaking under me. "About time, too. You sit on me like a sack of bricks every day, but do I complain? No. Well, except now. Now I complain. The sheer pettiness of my furniture caught me off guard. My lamp flickered knowingly, its voice smooth and a little smug. "Oh, we've had plenty to say for years. You're just finally tuned in." The idea of everything in my home having private opinions about me was deeply unsettling, yet also bizarrely entertaining. What else had I missed? Was my vacuum passive-aggressive? Did my showerhead have stage fright? The possibilities were endless. Later, I stepped outside, thinking the fresh air might do me good. Bad move. The moment I closed the doormat whined. "Wipe your feet better. You always track dirt, and it's disgusting." I apologized instinctively, which didn't feel great, and headed down the driveway. Then the real fun began. Birds weren't just chirping, they were bickering. 2 sparrows in a nearby tree were arguing over territory. "This is my branch," one screeched. "No, it's our branch," the other shot back. "We're literally married. What's yours is mine, remember?" Meanwhile, a pigeon waddling on the sidewalk muttered to itself. "People think they're better than me just because I poop wherever I want. Hypocrites." When I passed my neighbor's car, it grumbled, "If I have to listen to that awful country playlist one more time, I'm slashing my own tires." By the time I reached the park, I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or gaining some incredible insight into the secret lives of everything. A squirrel darted across my path, pausing to scowl at me. "Got any snacks?" it demanded. "No." Typical. Humans are the worst. I wandered over to a bench to collect myself, but the bench immediately groaned. "Oh great, another sitter. Can't a bench get a break? I'm practically splinters over here." I apologized out of reflex and stood up again, which seemed to appease it. Then, just as I was starting to feel like I could handle this new reality, a gust of wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and I swear they all sighed in unison. One particularly large oak grumbled. "Would it kill you people to stop carving initials into us? Honestly, we're trees, not diaries." I couldn't help but laugh at that. It was too ridiculous. The tree seemed to appreciate the reaction, creaking softly as if nodding. By the end of the day, I'd come to accept that everything around me, from my furniture to the birds in the sky, had something to say. And the truth? It wasn't all bad. Sure, my toaster was a bit of a diva, and my chair clearly resented me, but there was something comforting about the chatter. It was like living inside a sitcom where every inanimate object and animal was a supporting character. So now I'm wondering, if you could spend a day in a world where everything talks, your bed, your shoes, the trees outside, would you? Or would the constant commentary drive you completely bonkers? Let's start a new story. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I'm standing on the cracked sidewalk outside the corner store again. The air smells faintly like hot asphalt and penny candy, and there's this weightless kind of excitement buzzing through me, like everything in the world is about to happen. I've got a crumpled $5 bill in my pocket, practically a fortune back then, and my biggest worry is whether to spend it on a paper sleeve of pixie sticks or one of those absurdly large jawbreakers that could last a week if you were patient enough. Spoiler, I was never patient enough. The store itself was tiny, one of those old places that felt like it had been there forever. The door had this little bell that jingled when you walked in, and the linoleum floor was always a bit sticky, but nobody cared. There was a claw machine in the corner with prizes that might as well have been gold-plated to us kids. Plastic keychains, rubber aliens, tiny stuffed animals whose stitching was already coming loose. I don't think I ever actually won anything from that machine, but I kept trying, convinced that my next quarter would be the one. Summers felt endless back then. The days stretched out, long and shimmering, with no real beginning or end. My friends and I would take off on our bikes as soon as the sun was high, pedaling aimlessly through the neighborhood like a roving pack of explorers. We had this unofficial meeting spot, a gnarled old oak tree at the edge of a field where someone's older brother had once tied a rope swing. It wasn't much, but it was ours. We'd spend hours there, swinging out over the tall grass and daring each other to go higher, until the rope creaked ominously, and someone inevitably chickened out. There was this one summer when we became obsessed with building a treehouse. We had no plan, no tools besides a rusty hammer and some bent nails we found in someone's dad's garage, and absolutely no idea what we were doing. But we were determined. We scavenged scraps of wood from a nearby construction site, which, looking back, was definitely not allowed, and tried to nail them into the branches of a random tree. It was a disaster. Nothing stayed in place, and the whole thing collapsed before we'd even finished it. But we laughed until our sides hurt, lying in the dirt with the sun on our faces, swearing we'd try again tomorrow. We never did, but the memory of that day has stuck with me like a badge of honor. Winter had its own kind of magic. When the first big snowstorm hit, the world transformed overnight into something quieter, softer. My siblings and I would pile on mismatched layers, 2 pairs of socks, hand-me-down scarves that dragged in the snow, mittens with holes in the thumbs, and charge outside like warriors into a sparkling, frost-covered battlefield. The snowdrifts were always taller than they seemed, and we'd sinking up to our knees, laughing as we tried to crawl out. We built forts that leaned dangerously to one side and lobbed snowballs at each other until we were too cold to move. Then we'd trudge back inside, cheeks burning and noses red, to find my mom waiting with mugs of hot chocolate. She always gave us the good marshmallows, the big, fluffy ones that melted just enough to make a sticky layer on top. There's something about those moments that feels like a secret, like they're locked away in a part of me that only comes alive when the world is quiet, and I let my mind wander back. They weren't extraordinary. They were small, fleeting things. The sound of the radio crackling in the background while my dad worked on a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table. The way the streetlights painted soft yellow circles on the pavement when I walked home from a friend's house at dusk. Even the way the ice cream truck's jingle seemed to echo forever through the humid summer air, a sound that made every kid drop whatever they were doing and sprint like their lives depended on it. Sometimes I think about the tiny rituals we used to have, the kind of rituals that feel monumental when you're a kid, even though they're so ordinary. Like how every Friday night, my family would pile onto the couch to watch some random movie we'd rented from the video store. The best part was picking the movie. We'd wander the aisles for what felt like hours, debating the merits of The Sandlot versus Honey. I Shrunk the Kids, even though we all knew my dad would end up choosing some boring action flick he'd already seen twice. But we didn't care. We'd settle in with bowls of popcorn and blankets, the glow of the TV screen lighting up the room, and it felt like the safest, coziest place in the world. Even school had its moments. I know that sounds ridiculous, but hear me out. There was this weird comfort in the monotony of it. Passing notes under the desk, doodling in the margins of my notebook, waiting for the clock to finally tick over to 3 o'clock. And on rare, magical occasions, we'd have a snow day. Those were like a gift from the universe, an unexpected stretch of freedom where anything seemed possible. My friends and I would bundle up and drag our sleds to the steepest hill in the neighborhood, screaming all the way down and crashing into each other at the bottom in a tangle of laughter and icy snow. I don't know what it is about those memories that makes them stick. They're not the big milestones or the once-in-a-lifetime moments. They're the quiet, unassuming ones. The kind you don't even realize are important until years later, when you're sitting in traffic or scrolling through your phone, and something triggers a memory so vivid it's like stepping into a time machine. It's a warmth, a kind of homesickness for a place that doesn't exist anymore, except in the folds of my mind. What about you? What's the one memory you always come back to when you need a little piece of comfort? Let's start a new story. The other day, I found myself utterly hypnotized by a video of someone using a robotic vacuum to carry snacks across the living room. There it was, gliding like a tiny butler, delivering potato chips with the solemn dignity of a professional caterer. And I couldn't help but laugh, because somewhere in our quest for innovation, we'd accidentally reinvented a pet that vacuums and delivers snacks. Isn't that just the perfect summary of modern life? We wanted efficiency, but we ended up with whimsy. And I think that's the secret charm of the world today. Every so often, practicality bumps into absurdity, and they both decide to hang out. Think about the ways we've subtly changed how we live in just the last few decades. Once upon a time, you call someone and hope they picked up. Now, you text first to warn them that you're about to call, because God forbid anyone answers a phone unprepared. And then there's voicemail. Remember when it was a critical tool for communication? Now it's basically a cryptic puzzle, reserved for your parents or doctors. Every voicemail starts with a polite "call me back" and ends with you texting them to ask what they wanted. Efficiency, my friends. Even the way we argue has evolved. It used to be simple, two people face-to-face hashing things out. Now we have text debates, an entirely different species of conflict. You start with a calm, "I think we should talk about this." And by the third paragraph, you're slamming your thumbs against the screen like it's a final boss battle in a video game. Then, inevitably, someone drops the nuclear option, the unsanctioned use of the read receipt. Nothing says, "I'm done here," like leaving a blue check mark hanging in digital silence. Our love for convenience has also made life wonderfully strange. Like grocery shopping. Remember when you'd physically go to the store, list in hand, and maybe bump into a neighbor in the cereal aisle? Now, you can have an avocado and a scented candle delivered to your door at 2 a.m. because apparently, the world decided that nighttime is when we're most vulnerable to craving guacamole and ambience. Even stranger, the apps remember what you've bought before, which means they've quietly become your nosiest roommate. "Are you sure you don't want that ice cream you ordered last time?" They ask, judgment-free but painfully aware. Social rituals have transformed too, often in ways that feel surreal. Take weddings. They used to be about gathering your closest friends and family, sharing vows, and dancing badly to a DJ's questionable playlist. Now, there's cinematic productions. The first time I saw a drone swoop over a couple exchanging rings, I thought we'd accidentally wandered into an action movie. I half expected explosions in the background and dramatic slow-mo. The guests were all in coordinated pastels. The cake was probably too beautiful to eat, and I kept thinking, does anyone actually sit in the chairs with the velvet bows? Or are they just set pieces? But it's not just the big events. It's the little everyday rituals, too. Remember how spontaneous Friday nights used to be? You just knock on a friend's door or call them up and say, "Want to hang out?" Now, plans are a weeks-long negotiation involving 3 group chats, a scheduling app, and at least one poll about dietary restrictions. And yet, somehow, when you finally meet up, it feels like an achievement worthy of a trophy. Congratulations! You successfully coordinated 6 adults with wildly incompatible calendars. And let's talk about entertainment for a second. Back in the day, you'd flip through channels, find something tolerable, and commit to it. Now, with streaming, the real show is watching someone scroll endlessly through options, muttering, "I've heard this one's good," but never actually clicking on anything. I once watched a friend spend a full hour trying to pick a movie, only to give up and suggest we just rewatch The Office. It's a kind of performance art at this point. What really gets me, though, is how we've redefined community. It used to be the people in your town, your school, your office. Now, it's the random stranger who likes your overly specific tweet about pineapple on pizza, or the person you've never met but feel deeply connected to because you both joined the same online knitting group. These connections are fragile, sure, but also oddly profound. I mean, where else can you bond with someone 5,000 miles away over your shared disdain for wet socks? And let's not forget modern parenting. Once, it was all about telling kids to go play outside and hoping they didn't break anything. Now, parents are balancing screen time, STEM toys, and activities that look suspiciously like college prep disguised as finger painting. The kids, meanwhile, have cracked the system and learned how to build entire universes in Minecraft while we're still Googling how to fix the Wi-Fi. It's both inspiring and slightly terrifying. What I find most heartwarming, though, is how these changes haven't erased our humanity. We still laugh, still find joy in the ridiculous. Like the time my friend sent me a photo of her cat sitting on her laptop during a Zoom meeting, looking like it was about to close a major business deal. Or the day I got a notification from my smart fridge telling me the milk was expiring, as if it was some kind of lactose-related emergency. Life has become a surreal comedy, and I, for one, am here for it. So here's my question. What's the most wonderfully weird thing about modern life that you've noticed? Maybe it's something small, like how everyone seems to have an emotional support water bottle now. Or something big, like how TikTok can teach you how to fix your sink while also making you cry over a dog rescue story. I'd love to hear what makes you stop, laugh, and think, this world is ridiculous, and I wouldn't change a thing. Let's start a new story. The rain came in waves, soft at first, then hard enough to drum against the windows like impatient fingers. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of cold tea and a pile of unopened mail, watching the water streak the glass. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemons and something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the age of the house itself, like wood and earth had gotten tangled up in the walls over the years. When I heard the knock, I thought I imagined it. It was too quiet, too deliberate. But it came again, louder this time. At the door stood a boy. No, a young man, maybe 17 or 18, soaked to the skin. His hoodie clung to him like a second layer of flesh, his hair dark with rain. He looked at me with eyes that didn't match his face, old and sharp, like they didn't belong to someone his age. "Hi," he said. No smile, no explanation. Just that one word, balanced on the edge of something unsaid. "Can I help you?" I asked, not sure if I was supposed to feel curious or cautious. "I think you dropped this," he said, reaching into his pocket. His hand emerged with something small, metallic, and impossibly familiar, a key. I stared at it, my stomach doing an odd sort of flip. "That's not mine." His brow furrowed like he hadn't expected that answer. He glanced down at the key, then back at me. "You're sure?" "Yes, I'm sure. I don't even know what it's for." "It's yours," he said with the kind of certainty you can't argue with. "You'll figure it out." Before I could say anything else, he pressed the key into my hand and walked away, disappearing into the rain like he'd never been there at all. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, the key cool and heavy in my palm. It was an old-fashioned kind of key, the kind that belonged to a lock that probably didn't exist anymore. But it didn't feel old. It felt deliberate, like it had been waiting for me. That night, I couldn't stop looking at it. I turned it over in my hands, the ridges catching the light, the weight of it too significant for something so small. It wasn't just a key. It was a question, one I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. The dreams started soon after. They weren't nightmares, but they weren't pleasant either. In them, I was always in a room I didn't recognize. Dark wood floors, walls lined with bookshelves that stretched higher than they should have. The air was heavy, like the room itself was alive, watching me. And somewhere in the distance, a door waited. Each time, I woke up gasping, my chest tight, the key still sitting on my nightstand like a quiet accusation. I started carrying it with me, tucked into the pocket of my jacket. I told myself it was just easier than leaving it at home, but the truth was, I couldn't let it go. It had rooted itself in my thoughts, pulling at me like a thread I couldn't stop unraveling. And then, a week later, I found the door. It wasn't like in the dreams. No towering bookshelves or flickering shadows. It was just a door at the back of an antique shop I'd wandered into while killing time. I wasn't even looking for it, but as soon as I saw it, I knew. The door was old and scuffed, its paint peeling in uneven strips. But the lock was pristine, gleaming like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. For me to notice it, I pulled the key from my pocket, my hand shaking slightly. It slid into the lock like it had always belonged there, turning with a soft, satisfying click. The door swung open. Behind it was not the storeroom I'd expected, but a hallway. Narrow, dimly lit, the air cool and faintly metallic. It smelled like rain and something else, something I couldn't name but instinctively understood. I should have turned back. I knew that. But the hallway pulled me forward, each step heavier than the last, like the air itself was thickening. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cloudy and uneven. As I walked, the reflections shifted, not just my own, but others. Faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been. At the end of the hallway was another door, this one smaller, less ornate. The key didn't fit this time, but as I reached for the handle, the door opened on its own. Inside was the room from my dreams. The bookshelves stretched impossibly high, their edges lost in shadow. The air buzzed with something electric, the kind of energy you feel before a storm. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a box. The box was simple, wooden, unadorned, about the size of a shoebox. But like the key, it didn't feel old. It felt purposeful. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was nothing. No, not nothing. Air. A pocket of air that shimmered like heat rising off asphalt. I leaned closer, and the shimmer shifted, forming shapes, images, moments. My moments. Memories I hadn't thought about in years. Replaying like scenes from a film. My first bike ride. The argument with my father the night before he left. The way my sister used to braid my hair when I couldn't stop crying. I reached out, and the air wrapped around my hand, warm and alive. It wasn't showing me memories. It was offering them back. But something else moved in the shadows. I could feel it, a presence, patient and watchful. The boy's voice echoed in my mind. It's yours. You'll figure it out. The box wasn't giving me my memories. It was asking for something in return. I closed the lid. The room sighed, the air shifting, and I felt the hallway behind me beckon again. The mirrors were blank now, their surfaces smooth and empty. The key in my pocket felt lighter, like it had finished its purpose. When I stepped back into the antique shop, the door was gone. Only a blank wall remained, dust settling where it had stood. I still have the key, though I don't know why. The box's offer lingers in my mind, and sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd said yes. Let's start a new story. It was one of those blisteringly ordinary mornings when you move through the world on autopilot. Your mind half focused on a to-do list you haven't written down yet. I was in a hardware store, wandering the aisles with a basket full of things I didn't really need. A pack of batteries, some picture hooks, and a can of spray paint for a project I'd probably never get around to. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the smell of lumber and varnish filled the air, sharp and clean. And then, as I turned a corner, it happened. A squeak. Not the sharp kind of squeak a cartwheel makes when it's loose, but something softer, high-pitched, and almost melodic. I froze, unsure why it hit me so hard, and tilted my head toward the sound. There it was again, 2 long, rubbery notes, followed by a faint metallic rattle. It was a dog's squeaky toy. I stood there, staring dumbly at a bin of rubber chew toys shaped like hot dogs and dinosaurs, and my brain began assembling the pieces of a memory I didn't know I'd lost. It wasn't the toys themselves that got me. It was the sound, that specific pitch, the way it rose and fell like a laugh hidden in plastic. I had no dog, no reason for this to mean anything to me, but the squeak kept pulling, kept tugging at something buried deep. And then, like a match catching flame, it came back, my grandfather's basement. He had a giant metal trunk down there, one of those battered army green ones with heavy latches and a dent in the corner. It sat against the far wall, half hidden by piles of old tools and paint cans, and it wasn't until I was 6 or 7 that I learned what was inside. My cousins and I called it the mystery box, which, looking back, was way too grand a name for what it really was, a jumble of forgotten odds and ends. But to us, it was treasure. I remembered how we'd clamber over each other to get the lid open, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside were a million tiny worlds, scratched-up action figures missing limbs, plastic dinosaurs whose paint was flaking off in big, sad patches, and of course a collection of dog toys, rubber chickens, grinning frogs, squeaky bones, all left over from a dog none of us had ever met. Old Daisy stuff, my grandpa used to say with a shrug, though none of us knew who Daisy was. The thing is, it wasn't about the toys themselves. It was about what we made them into. A single squeaky bone could be a laser gun. A rubber frog could be the villain in a complex plot involving knights and talking horses. My cousins and I built entire universes down there, giggling and shrieking until my grandpa would thump on the floor above us and shout, Take it down a notch, or you'll wake the ghosts. I smiled to myself, standing there in that hardware store aisle, the sound of that squeak still echoing in my ears. The weight of the basket in my hand felt suddenly strange, out of place, like I was holding on to something that didn't quite belong in this version of my life. I set it down and grabbed one of the rubber toys from the bin, a blue fish with bulging cartoon eyes, and gave it a cautious squeeze. The squeak was higher than I remembered, brighter, but it was close enough. Close enough to feel like I was pulling that old trunk open again, rummaging through its dusty contents. For the rest of the day, I couldn't let it go. The memory stayed with me, tugging at the corners of my mind. It wasn't sad, exactly, but it had a kind of weight to it, like it was reminding me of something I hadn't realized I'd lost. The kind of endless, open creativity that comes from being a kid in a basement full of junk, where everything you touch feels like the start of an adventure. When I got home, I tossed the fish onto the couch, half laughing at myself for being sentimental. It bounced and rolled to a stop, staring at me with its ridiculous cartoon eyes. Later that night, though, when I was clearing away the day's clutter, I found myself holding it again, turning it over in my hands. I squeezed it one more time, letting the squeak echo through my quiet apartment, and for a moment I wasn't there. I was back in that basement, surrounded by the hum of an old dehumidifier and the faint smell of motor oil. I could almost hear my cousins' voices, the way they'd argue over who got to be the hero this time, who got to fight the dragon or rescue the princess. I could almost feel the rough concrete floor under my legs, the way we'd sit cross-legged for hours, lost in our little worlds. I don't know what happened to the mystery box. It probably got tossed when my grandparents downsized, along with 100 other small, unremarkable pieces of my childhood. But that squeak, that silly plastic sound, it's still here, lodged in my brain like a secret I didn't know I was keeping. And now I have this ridiculous blue fish sitting on my bookshelf, tucked between real books and grown-up things, like a little portal back to a version of myself I almost forgot existed. So tell me, what's the strangest, smallest thing that's ever brought you back? What little piece of your past found its way into your hands when you least expected it? Let's start a new story. The house had been empty for months, abandoned really. The new owners wouldn't move in until spring, and for now, it sat silent and forgotten, a hulking shadow at the end of the cul-de-sac. We weren't even sure why we went inside. My brother said something about one last look, but I think we both knew it was just an excuse. The place had been sold, our childhood shuffled into boxes and carted away, and we hadn't properly said goodbye. The door wasn't locked. It groaned as we pushed it open, the sound too loud in the stillness, like the house itself was startled to see us. The air was different inside, cooler, stale, but familiar, like the ghosts of old dinners and late-night laughs had been trapped in the walls. Dust hung in the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the floor creaked beneath our feet in all the same spots it always had. We didn't say much, just wandered through the rooms like strangers in a place we once knew. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the empty countertops stripped of their stories. The living room was bare except for the faint outline of where the rug had been, a pale rectangle on the floor. Even my bedroom, which I'd painted a rebellious shade of blue in high school, seemed foreign now, just a box of walls and memories I wasn't ready to let go of. And then I found the box. It was in the attic, tucked away in a corner I hadn't noticed before. A cardboard box, sealed with brittle tape and covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like it had been there for decades. My brother was calling me from downstairs, but I didn't answer. Something about the box stopped me. It didn't belong to us, I was sure of that. But it was here in our house, waiting. I peeled back the tape. Inside, there were jars. Dozens of them, glass mason jars with metal lids, each one filled with something different. At first, I thought it was just dirt, tiny collections of soil from some long-forgotten gardening project. But when I held one up to the light, I saw it wasn't dirt at all. It was something else, something finer, almost like ash, but not quite. And written on each jar, in careful black ink, was a single word: summer. Then, laughter, leaves. The words were so simple, so strange, that I almost laughed. But then I opened one. It was the jar labeled summer. The lid gave a soft pop, and in an instant, the attic disappeared. I was outside, barefoot on warm pavement, the sun pressing down like a gentle weight on my shoulders. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and sunscreen, and somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler was ticking, water glittering in an arc across someone's front yard. I could feel the heat of the day in my skin, the kind that makes you lazy and restless all at once. It was so vivid, so real, that I reached out, expecting to touch the edge of the sky. And then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. I was back in the attic, the jar still in my hands. My heart was pounding. I opened another. This one was labeled rain. The air around me shifted, cool and damp, and I heard the first heavy drops on a tin roof. The smell of wet pavement rose like steam, earthy and metallic, and I could feel the shiver of a hoodie pulled tight against my arms. The sound of rain deepened, rolling in waves, and I was a kid again, watching droplets race down a window while thunder rumbled softly in the distance. One by one, I opened the jars. Each one was its own world, a perfect sliver of a moment pulled from somewhere deeper than memory. Laughter was my mother's voice, a peal of joy that echoed through a kitchen I didn't recognize, but somehow knew. Leaves was the crunch of autumn underfoot, the crisp smell of wood smoke, and the ache of air that warned winter was coming. By the time my brother climbed up to find me, the attic was filled with the faint remnants of these moments: warmth, rain, whispers of light and sound. He asked me what I was doing, and I tried to explain, but how do you tell someone you've been holding pieces of the past in your hands? We didn't take the box with us. I wanted to, but something told me it wasn't ours to keep. Instead, we sealed it up again, left it there for whoever might find it next. Maybe they need it more than we did. Maybe they'd open the jar labeled home. When we left the house that day, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been given something I didn't know I was missing. Even now, I think about that box, those jars, and what might have been in the ones I didn't open. Maybe they were filled with things too big to name, things you can't trap in words but carry with you just the same. So, I have to ask, if you could bottle a moment, any moment, what would yours hold? Let's start a new story. I was the only person in the world who knew that the clouds were fake. Not all of them, of course, just the ones over my house. It sounds absurd, I know, but let me explain how I figured it out. It started a month ago, on a Thursday morning. I'd woken up to an unfamiliar sound, a mechanical hum that seemed to hover just outside my bedroom window. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, like the kind of noise that worms its way into your skull. I pulled back the curtain and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual cul-de-sac quiet. My neighbor's pickup parked at an angle, a couple of kids dragging scooters down the street. But then I looked up, and that's when I noticed it. The clouds weren't moving. Not in the lazy, meandering way clouds drift when you're lying in the grass and trying to find animal shapes. These clouds were static. It was like someone had pressed pause on the sky. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe some kind of atmospheric fluke. But as the day wore on, I couldn't stop checking. Whenever I glanced out the window, there they were, stuck in place like a badly rendered video game skybox. I didn't tell anyone at first. I mean, what do you even say? Hey, do you think the clouds look broken? People would have laughed it off, or worse, assumed I'd finally cracked under the pressure of life. So, I kept it to myself, telling myself it was probably nothing. But then the pattern started. Every morning, the clouds were different. Not like weather different, but staged like props in a play. One day, they formed a perfect spiral, like the galaxy was spinning directly above my roof. Another day, they were jagged and angular, like shards of glass. Once, they even looked pixelated, as if someone had zoomed in too far on a low-resolution image. By the second week, I'd become obsessed. I started documenting them with my phone, taking videos and snapping photos from every angle. But here's the thing. Whenever I try to show anyone, the pictures would look completely normal. The clouds, static and eerie to my eyes, appeared ordinary on the screen. It was driving me mad. I started to lose sleep, spending my nights staring out the window, waiting for the clouds to slip up and reveal something. Anything. But they never did. They just hovered there, silently mocking me. One night, after hours of cloud watching, I decided to go for a drive to clear my head. I hadn't gone more than 3 blocks when I noticed the hum again, that mechanical drone I'd heard the first morning. Only this time it was louder. It seemed to be coming from above me. I pulled over and stepped out of the car, craning my neck to see the sky. That's when I spotted it, a black dot moving against the clouds. It was hard to make out at first, but as it got closer, I realized it was some kind of drone. Not the off-the-shelf kind you see at parks or weddings, but a sleek, military-looking thing with blades that shimmered unnaturally in the moonlight. I followed it. Don't ask me why. Curiosity had long since overpowered my common sense. The drone led me to the edge of town, to an industrial park I'd always assumed was abandoned. It landed on the roof of a warehouse, its lights winking out like a firefly. The warehouse was dark, but the side door was slightly ajar, spilling a sliver of pale green light onto the cracked pavement. I should have turned back. Any sane person would have turned back. But I wasn't sane anymore, not after weeks of staring at those cursed clouds. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone. The room was enormous, filled with rows of computers and monitors, all humming with activity. At the center of it all was a massive screen, displaying a live feed of my house. Not just the roof or the street, but inside. My living room, my bedroom, even the bathroom. Enjoying the show? A voice asked. I whipped around to see a man standing behind me, wearing a lab coat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. He didn't answer right away, just stepped past me to tap a few keys on one of the keyboards. The big screen flickered, and suddenly, the fake clouds were gone. The feed now showed a metallic dome covering my neighborhood, stretching far into the horizon. "You're part of an experiment," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "The clouds are a containment mechanism, you could say. Helps us control variables." "Control what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Behavior," he replied, turning to face me. "It's incredible what people will do when they believe the world is real. But you weren't supposed to notice." Before I could respond, there was a sharp prick in my neck and everything went black. I woke up in my bed the next morning, drenched in sweat. At first, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I looked outside, the clouds were back, perfectly normal, drifting lazily across the sky. Except now, I can't stop wondering, how much of the world is real, and how much of it is just clouds? Let's start a new story. It was the middle of November when the idea first sparked, and by the time it fully ignited, there was no stopping it. The catalyst was harmless enough. A box of confiscated phones locked in the principal's office. If you got caught texting in class, that's where your phone went, and you had to endure the humiliation of having your parents come to retrieve it. The rule wasn't just strict, it was personal. Our principal, Mr. Vickers, was notorious for his disdain for teen distractions, which he loved to rant about during assemblies. If you can't survive without a glowing rectangle for 8 hours, maybe you don't deserve to graduate, he'd sneered at us just last week. That line lit the match. It was Freddie who whispered the plan to me during study hall, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "We're getting the phones back," he said simply. "Freddie, he's got a key code," I replied. "And cameras." Freddie smirked. "Yeah, but he doesn't have a backup plan if someone changes the system." It started with Luke. The tech was in our grade. Luke was the kind of guy who hacked the school Wi-Fi for fun and once replaced the library's computer homepage with a Rick Astley video. He was terrifyingly brilliant and criminally bored. When Freddie presented the idea, Luke was in before the pitch was even finished. "Simple," he said, cracking his knuckles. "We clone the code reader. I need a minute with the keypad." This was where Maddie came in. Maddie was the drama club star, and she could cry on command. During a well-timed breakdown outside the principal's office, complete with sobs about her missing chemistry project, she managed to distract the secretary long enough for Luke to photograph the keypad. By the end of the day, we had everything we needed to access the Vault of Doom. But Freddie wasn't satisfied with just getting the phones back. No, this wasn't about rebellion. This was about spectacle. "We need a decoy," he said, spinning a pen between his fingers. "Something that'll make them forget about the phones." "What kind of decoy?" I asked warily. Freddie leaned in like a villain revealing his masterstroke. "A paranormal incident. This was how I found myself at midnight, sneaking into the gym with 2 gallons of fake blood, a Bluetooth speaker, and a backpack full of random junk Luke insisted would sell the illusion. Freddy had chosen the gym because it was the last place anyone would expect something supernatural. It's too normal, he explained. We make it haunted and they'll never look anywhere else. The setup was equal parts ingenious and ridiculous. Maddie painted cryptic symbols on the floor while Luke rigged the speaker to blast eerie whispers through the air vents. I spread the fake blood in careful streaks across the bleachers and lockers, trying not to think about how it looked like we were auditioning for a low-budget horror movie. Freddy's piece de resistance was a mannequin he'd stolen from his dad's hardware store, dressed in a torn varsity jacket. It was creepy enough to give me chills, even before Luke wired its eyes to glow red. By 3 a.m., we were ready. The gym looked like a portal to hell had opened in the middle of PE class. Satisfied, we crept to the office. Luke punched in the clone code, and the door clicked open. Inside, the confiscated phones sat neatly on shelves, glowing faintly with missed notifications. It felt like a treasure trove. We worked quickly, stuffing the phones into backpacks and leaving a single post-it on the desk. Written in Luke's ominously neat handwriting, it read, "They've been reclaimed." The next morning was pure chaos. The whispers from the vents started at 8:15, just as first period gym class began. Within minutes, students were fleeing the gym, some screaming, others snapping photos. Mr. Vickers arrived on the scene, trying to restore order, only to freeze when he saw the glowing-eyed mannequin slumped against the bleachers. "Who did this?" he bellowed, his voice cracking. By lunchtime, the school was in full meltdown. Paranormal theories spread like wildfire. Some claimed they'd seen the mannequin move. Others swore the whispers had called their names. The local news even showed up, broadcasting footage of Maddie's bloody symbols and interviewing a teary-eyed sophomore who insisted the gym was cursed. Meanwhile, the phones were quietly returned to their rightful owners. Freddy delivered them like some kind of Robin Hood, slipping them into lockers with whispered instructions to play dumb if anyone asked. By the time the school realized the phones were gone, the gym incident had completely overshadowed the theft. The best part was the fallout. Mr. Vickers, refusing to admit he'd been outsmarted, doubled down on the paranormal angle. He hired a paranormal investigator to cleanse the gym, a guy who showed up with a Ghostbuster-style contraption and spent hours waving a metal stick at nothing. Luke, who hacked the investigator's website, discovered he was just a guy named Carl who specialized in hauntings for corporate retreats. The gym was closed for 2 weeks for spiritual remediation, and the mannequin ended up locked in a supply closet, where it reportedly freaked out a janitor who thought it was a student hiding from detention. As for the blood and symbols, the administration chalked it up to an overactive imagination and quietly repainted the gym floor. We never got caught. To this day, people still whisper about the haunted gym. Freddy graduated with the satisfaction of knowing he'd pulled off the greatest heist in school history, while Luke parlayed his hacking skills into a summer internship at a tech startup. Every now and then, I wonder if Mr. Vickers ever suspects the truth. Probably not. As far as he's concerned, it was just another cautionary tale about the dangers of glowing rectangles and teenage rebellion. Let's start a new story. It was a Tuesday morning, though it could have been any day. The sky hung low and gray, and the streets smelled faintly of wet asphalt and brewing coffee. I walked the same route I always did, past the corner shop where the barista already knew my order, past the florist arranging peonies in a metal bucket, past the bakery that always made the air feel warm. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have caught my attention. And yet, there was something about the way the city moved that morning, like the rhythm of it had shifted ever so slightly. I stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the signal to change. Across the street, a boy in a bright yellow raincoat was crouched by a puddle. His mother tugged at his hand, impatient, but he was utterly transfixed, staring at his reflection in the water. I couldn't see his face, but I imagined the wonder there, the tiny scientist in him observing how raindrops rippled the surface, how his own image shimmered and broke apart with every tremor. His mother gave up and looked at her phone, the leash in her other hand pulling at a small, anxious dog. The light turned green, And we all moved. Me, the boy, the mother, the dog, the office workers in suits, the woman with the headphones. It was like watching a tide roll in, each of us carried forward by the same unspoken force. I thought of how strange it was that we all just understood this. No one taught us how to cross a street together, to walk without colliding, to pause for just the right amount of time when someone steps in your path. It felt choreographed, like we'd all rehearsed our parts in secret. As I passed a bus stop, I saw a man pacing with a phone pressed to his ear. His free hand was gesturing wildly, as if the person on the other end could see him. A woman sitting on the bench watched him, her gaze drifting between his frantic movements and the bus schedule pinned to the shelter wall. I wondered if she was listening, piecing together his side of the conversation like fragments of a puzzle. Or maybe she wasn't listening at all. Maybe she was lost in her own thoughts, trying to remember if she'd left the stove on or what her kid needed for school tomorrow. The bus came and went, and I kept walking, my shoes making soft, even sounds against the wet pavement. Ahead of me, a man was unloading crates of oranges onto the sidewalk, his hands moving fast but steady. The oranges were so bright, they almost seemed to glow, little bursts of sunlight piled in a pyramid. A woman passing by stopped to buy one, and I watched as she tucked it into her coat pocket like a secret. She didn't peel it or eat it. She just carried it with her, as if holding on to that piece of color was enough. At the park, a group of kids were playing tag, their shrieks of laughter cutting through the damp air. A girl with pigtails darted past me, her sneakers slapping against the ground, and for a second, I felt the wind of her movement. She was being chased by a boy who seemed just on the verge of catching her, his arms outstretched, his face set in fierce concentration. But then she twisted away at the last moment, her hair flying, her smile wild with triumph. Watching them, I felt a pang of something. Nostalgia, maybe, or longing for that kind of unself-conscious joy. Near the edge of the park, an older man sat on a bench feeding the pigeons. He tossed crumbs from a paper bag, and the birds swarmed around him, their wings flapping in a blur of gray and white. Most people walked past without looking, but one little girl stopped and stared, her eyes wide with fascination. The man noticed her and offered her the bag. And for a moment, the two of them were connected, strangers united by something as simple as bread and birds. As I left the park, the rain started again, soft and steady. People pulled out umbrellas, their movements almost synchronized, and the street filled with a patchwork of colors: red, blue, black, polka-dotted. I didn't have an umbrella, so I tucked my hands into my pockets and kept walking, feeling the rain soak through my jacket. Somewhere ahead, a street musician started playing a violin, the notes rising and falling in time with the patter of rain. A few people slowed down to listen, their faces softening. One man tossed a coin into the musician's open case, the sound of it landing sharp and bright against the velvet lining. It struck me then how much of our lives are made up of these tiny, invisible connections. A glance exchanged at a crosswalk, the hum of a song overheard in passing, the warmth of a stranger's smile. None of it planned, none of it lasting, but all of it adding up to something bigger, something that feels almost like magic. As I turned the corner toward home, I couldn't help but feel like a visitor in my own city, like I was seeing it all for the first time. The ordinary had become extraordinary, the familiar strange and wonderful. So now I'm wondering, what part of our everyday society makes you feel like a traveler in your own world? Let's start a new story. It was our third date, that unspoken tipping point where everything could either fizzle out or suddenly bloom into something you'd remember years later. She suggested meeting at the aquarium downtown. Not my usual scene, but her enthusiasm made it impossible to say no. When she texted, "I have a surprise for you, but you have to trust me," I wasn't sure if I should be excited or nervous. Turns out, it would be both. The aquarium was nearly empty when we arrived, the late hour leaving just a handful of other stragglers wandering through the dimly lit exhibits. She grabbed my hand without warning and led me straight past the main attractions. No time for the majestic stingrays or the graceful sea turtles. "We'll come back to these," she promised, her eyes sparkling in the low light. First, the surprise. We stopped at a quiet corner, I hadn't noticed before, a tiny hallway leading to a cylindrical tank filled with moon jellyfish. They drifted like tiny galaxies, glowing softly in shades of blue and purple, their movements hypnotic. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, letting me take it in. Finally, she leaned closer and whispered, "This is the place." "The place for what?" I asked, but she just smiled and pulled out her phone. A moment later, the soft strains of music floated through the air. It was a song I recognized but couldn't name, something ethereal and haunting. "Dance with me," she said, stepping closer. I laughed under my breath, glancing around. "Here? Now? Here? Now?" she repeated, with a kind of certainty that made it impossible to argue. She held out her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, and before I knew it, we were swaying awkwardly in the faint glow of the jellyfish tank. I couldn't remember the last time I danced without worrying about rhythm or steps. Her movements weren't perfect either. She tripped over her own feet at one point, and we both dissolved into laughter. But none of it mattered. It was ridiculous and magical all at once, like a scene from a movie we didn't realize we were in. After the song ended, she pulled me down to sit on the floor in front of the tank. The jellyfish continued their silent choreography, oblivious to the little drama unfolding below them. "I come here when I need to think," she said softly. "They remind me that life doesn't have to be so frantic. You can just float sometimes, and it's okay." It was such a simple thing to say, but the way she said it made me feel like she was offering me a glimpse of some hidden, quieter part of herself. I told her about the places I went when I needed to escape. The park bench by the river where I used to sit with my grandmother, the library corner that smelled like old paper and calm. We traded pieces of ourselves back and forth, our voices low, as if we were afraid to break the spell the jellyfish had cast. At one point, she reached in her bag and pulled out a tiny glass jar with a cork stopper. Inside was a single, delicate jellyfish made of folded paper, its intricate curves and tendrils impossibly precise. She handed it to me without ceremony, watching my face for a reaction. "I make these when I'm stressed," she explained. "This one's for you, for when you need a reminder to float." I didn't know what to say. It wasn't just the gift, it was the thought behind it, the way she'd listened and cared enough to share something so personal with me. I held the jar up to the light, watching the paper jellyfish cast a faint shadow on my palm. "It's perfect," I said finally, and I meant it. We stayed until the aquarium staff gently shooed us out, laughing as we realized how late it had gotten. On the walk back to our cars, she slipped her arm through mine, her head tilted toward the stars. "So," she said with a grin, "did my surprise live up to the hype?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift, as if the ground beneath us had softened and rooted me in place at the same time. "It did," I said. "It really, really did." The paper jellyfish still sits on my desk, its delicate folds untouched by time. Sometimes, when life feels too chaotic, I'll hold it up to the light and remember the glow of the jellyfish, the music, the way her laugh echoed softly in the empty aquarium. It wasn't just a date. It was a moment when the world felt softer, like it was bending just a little to make space for something extraordinary. Have you ever had a date that felt like stepping into a dream you didn't want to wake up from? Let's start a new story. It started with a vending machine, not a dramatic malfunction or a frustrating stuck bag of chips, but just a regular vending machine at the train station on a humid Tuesday evening. I was coming back from a work trip, tired in a way that made me hate my own skin, and all I wanted was something cold. The train was delayed, the waiting room AC was broken, and every seat was occupied by people who looked equally miserable. So, I decided to get a bottle of water and loiter near the tracks like a dehydrated vagabond. The machine was old and temperamental, with a dim screen that blinked "insert coin" like it was taunting me. I fed it my last $2 in quarters, punched the code for water, B6, and waited. Instead of water, the machine spat out a small package wrapped in foil, no bigger than a deck of cards. I stared at it confused. There wasn't even a B6 option on the selection menu. I've been scammed by a robot. Curious, and maybe a little desperate for any distraction, I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, the foil crinkling as I turned it over. No label, no branding, just a faint imprint of what looked like an infinity symbol pressed into the foil. For a brief, absurd moment, I wondered if I'd just purchased some black market contraband by accident. What the hell? I muttered to myself and peeled it open. Inside was a cookie. A single, round, perfectly golden brown cookie. Not the prepackaged kind you get at gas stations, either. This looked homemade, the edges crisp, the center slightly soft, like it had been baked with actual care. It smelled amazing, like butter and sugar, and a hint of something I couldn't quite place, maybe almond or cardamom. For a second, I forgot how weird this all was and just stared at it like it might start explaining itself. And then, because it was a long day, and I'm not above eating mystery cookies from sketchy vending machines, I took a bite. It was the best cookie I've ever had in my life. I don't say that lightly. I've eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants. I've had my fair share of fancy desserts. But this was transcendent. The kind of flavor that feels like a memory you'd forgotten you had. It wasn't just good, it was familiar. Like the taste of summers the first hadn't lived, or the warmth of a grandmother's kitchen I'd never been to. I finished it in 3 bites, not caring who might be watching, and immediately felt lighter. Not in the physical sense, but like a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying had quietly dissolved. I stood there for a minute, licking crumbs off my fingers and wondering what kind of magical confectionery sorcery I'd just stumbled upon. My train arrived before I could investigate further, and the crowd swept me along, but the cookie stayed with me. Its taste, its impossible warmth. I kept thinking about it all the way home, replaying every bite in my head like a favorite song. The next day, I couldn't resist. I went back to the station. The same vending machine sat there, blinking its smug insert coin message, daring me to try my luck again. I fed it another $2, punched me 6, and held my breath. This time it gave me a small, folded piece of paper. No cookie, no snack, just a single sheet of thick, slightly yellowed paper folded into quarters. My first thought was that I'd somehow unlocked a hidden vending machine cult. But when I unfolded it, I found a handwritten note. Not all hungers are for the body. Not all gifts are for the taking. You gave what you needed to leave behind. Go live lighter. I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't signed, and there were no clues about who might have written it or why it had ended up in a vending machine. But as strange as it was, it didn't feel ominous. If anything, it felt kind like whoever wrote it knew me better than I knew myself. I didn't go back to the machine after that. I didn't want to chase the mystery or ruin whatever magic had happened. Instead, I started noticing little changes in myself, small but profound. I stopped holding on to grudges like they were trophies. I started answering my mom's calls without the usual dread of a lecture about my life choices. I smiled at strangers in elevators. I don't know if it was the cookie, the note, or just my own brain deciding to rewrite itself, but something shifted. Now, every time I see a vending machine, I think about that night. About how something so ordinary can hold something extraordinary, if you're willing to take a chance. So, tell me, have you ever found something so small, so random? Let's start a new story. The night began with the kind of easy banter that only years of friendship could build. Mila and I were sitting on the hood of my old beat-up car, the one she lovingly called the Tank, even though it barely survived on 2 cylinders. The summer sky above us was impossibly clear, the stars scattered like they'd been tossed there by a careless god. She handed me a beer, her wrist brushing against mine as she settled beside me, her bare feet propped against the windshield. "To us," she said, raising her bottle. "Masters of bad decisions and late-night adventures." I clinked my bottle against hers. To being a mess. It wasn't unusual for us to spend our nights like this, talking about everything and nothing, the world around us shrinking to just the 2 of us. What was unusual, though, was the silence that followed. Mila wasn't one to leave space for quiet. She filled every gap with laughter, stories, or half-sung lyrics to songs she didn't know. Tonight, though, she was staring at the sky, her beer untouched, her mind somewhere else. "You okay?" I asked, nudging her with my elbow. She hesitated, her fingers toying with the label on her bottle. "I was just thinking," she said finally, How weird it is that we've known each other forever, but there are still things we don't know about each other. Like what? I challenged, trying to keep it light. Like, she paused, chewing on her bottom lip, a habit she never could break. Have you ever thought about us? You know, as more than friends? Her words hit me like a gust of cold wind on a hot day, unexpected and jarring. I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. Mila, being Mila, filled the silence. Forget I said that. God, that was stupid. She laughed, but it was forced, brittle. Blame it on the beer, or the stars, or whatever. But I couldn't forget it. Her question unraveled something in me, a thread I hadn't even realized was there. I thought back to all the times I'd brushed her hair from her face without thinking, the way her laugh felt like my favorite song, the pang of jealousy I'd ignored every time she told me about some guy. I'd buried it all, convinced myself it was nothing. But now, sitting here with her, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Maybe I have, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide. What? I stared at the ground, suddenly hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from her. Thought about us, wondered what it would be like. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and the air between us buzzed with an energy I didn't know how to name. Then she laughed, not her usual carefree laugh, but something softer, like she was letting me in on a secret. Well, damn, she said, setting her beer down. Guess the feeling's mutual. It was surreal hearing her say that. For years, we'd been orbiting around each other, caught in our own gravitational pull, but never daring to collide. And now, here we were, suspended in this fragile moment, neither of us willing to break it. What now? I asked, half joking but mostly serious. She turned to me, her eyes searching mine. We could find out, she said simply. So we did. The kiss was tentative at first, like we were both afraid of ruining something precious. But then it deepened, and everything else, the stars, the car, the world, faded away. When we finally pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, her smile shy, but radiant. Well, she said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably, that was interesting. I laughed, running a hand through my hair. Yeah, interesting. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat there, side by side, the silence no longer awkward but comfortable, charged with possibilities. When we eventually climbed into the car, and I drove her home, she rested her head on my shoulder, her hand slipping into mine. It felt right in a way I couldn't explain. The days that followed were a blur of stolen kisses, late-night phone calls, and inside jokes that now carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't perfect. We were both terrified of messing up, of losing what we had. But it was real, and that was enough. Or so I thought. It was a Tuesday when everything fell apart. We were sitting in my apartment, the rain pounding against the windows. Mila had been quiet all night, her fingers tapping nervously against her thigh. Finally, she blurted out, I think we made a mistake. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. What are you talking about? This, she said, gesturing between us. It's not. I don't know if it's right. I felt my chest tighten, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. Why now? Everything's been fine, great even. Because I'm scared, she admitted, her voice breaking. Scared of ruining what we had, of losing you completely. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't. Deep down, I'd been scared too. Of failing her, of failing us. But the thought of letting her go was worse. So what do we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. I think we need to stop. Before we can't go back. It felt like the ground beneath me crumbled, but I nodded. Okay. We went back to being just friends, but it wasn't the same. The spark was still there, flickering at the edges of every conversation, every glance. We tried to ignore it, to bury it under laughter and routine, but it refused to die, and maybe it never will. Because some people, no matter how much time passes or how much you try to move on, will always feel like home. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Let's start a new story. Every Sunday night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft swirls of orange and lavender, we'd light the candle. It was this ridiculous thing we'd found at a flea market, shaped like a gnarled tree trunk with tiny carved owls nestled in its hollows. The vendor swore it was handmade and mystical, some kind of good luck charm for relationships. We didn't believe him for a second, but the sheer weirdness of it made us laugh, so we bought it anyway. The ritual started the night we brought it home. We'd spent the day rearranging our cramped studio apartment, trying to make it feel less like a storage unit and more like a home. By the time we were done, we were too tired to cook, so we sat cross-legged on the floor, eating leftover pizza straight from the box. On a whim, I pulled out the candle, lit it, and placed it between us. The flame flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just us, the candlelight, and the quiet hum of the city outside. "What now?" she'd asked, her voice soft and curious. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe we just talk?" And we did. We talked about everything, our favorite memories, our worst fears, the kind of people we wanted to be. It felt raw, like we were peeling back layers we didn't even know we had. By the time the candle sputtered out, we were lying on our backs, staring at the ceiling, feeling closer than ever. That night, without meaning to, we created something sacred. From then on, every Sunday night became our night. We'd light the candle and sit together. No phones, no distractions, just the two of us. Sometimes we'd talk, like we did that first night. Other times, we'd sit in silence, letting the flickering flame fill the spaces between us. It wasn't about what we did or didn't say. It was about being present, about creating a pocket of time that belonged only to us. Over time, the ritual evolved. We started writing little notes to each other, things we were grateful for, dreams we had, inside jokes that still made us laugh. We'd fold them up and tuck them into the hollow at the base of the candle. By the end of the year, the candle looked like a tree that had sprouted paper leaves, each one a tiny piece of us. One Sunday, after a particularly hard week, I almost didn't want to light the candle. Work had been brutal, and I felt too drained to be anything but a lump on the couch. But she lit it anyway, and when I sat down beside her, she pulled out one of our notes. It was one I'd written months ago. "Even on the worst days, you make the world feel softer." She didn't say anything, just slipped her hand into mine, and suddenly, the weight I'd been carrying felt a little lighter. The candle burned lower every week, its edges dripping like waxy tears. By the time we got to the last inch, we'd already started joking about finding a replacement. "Maybe a cactus this time," she said. "Or a dragon." "Definitely a dragon," I agreed. But secretly, I wasn't sure anything could replace it. The final Sunday with that candle felt different. We didn't write notes or talk much. We just watched the flame, knowing it was the last time we'd see it dance. When it flickered out, leaving only a thin wisp of smoke, we sat there for a while, holding hands, neither of us ready to move. We never did find another candle. Instead, the ritual changed again. Now, every Sunday night, we pull out the old notes and read them aloud, letting the words carry us back to those first quiet nights on the floor of our tiny apartment. Sometimes we laugh at how corny we were. Other times, we cry, reminded of all the little things we've weathered together. The candle may be gone, but its light still lingers, soft and warm, in the spaces we've built around each other. So, tell me, what little rituals add light to your life? Let's start a new story. The first time I saw her, she was stealing matches off the bar. Not in a sneaky way, but boldly, sliding the little boxes into the pocket of her leather jacket while making full eye contact with the bartender. He didn't seem to care. If anything, he looked entertained, like this was an inside joke between them. The place was a speakeasy tucked behind a laundromat, the kind of spot you only find if someone drags you there. For me, it was Nate, a co-worker who thought my hermit energy was ruining my 20s. "You don't have to marry anyone," he'd said while dragging me through the dryer line front. "Just let yourself have fun for once." I wasn't sure what kind of fun Nate had in mind, but the girl with the matches seemed like a good start. She had a messy, confident vibe, like she could pick a lock or start a revolution on a whim. Her lipstick was red enough to look dangerous under the dim lights, and when she turned and caught me staring, her grin was sharp enough to cut glass. "You like these?" she asked, holding up a matchbook between two fingers. Her voice carried over the murmur of the crowd, playful but challenging. "Not as much as you seem to," I replied, trying to match her energy. She laughed, loud and unreserved, and walked straight up to me like we'd known each other for years. "They're free. I just like the ritual of taking something." That was how it started. Not with fireworks, but with stolen matches and her daring me to order the bar's spiciest drink. It came out in a glass rimmed with chili powder and a warning from the bartender, who said most people only got halfway through before surrendering. She sipped hers like it was lemonade, watching with amused patience as I tried to keep my dignity intact. "Your face is turning red," she said, her voice tinged with mock concern. "And your lipstick smudged," I countered. She wiped at her mouth, then grinned when her thumb came away clean. "Nice try." The night unraveled like a story you don't realize you're in until halfway through. Her name was Delilah, which suited her in a way I didn't even try to articulate. She told me she was an artist, though she paid the bills working at a bakery. "Cakes are like edible sculptures," she explained. "Except people cry if you mess up." At some point, she grabbed my hand and pulled me toward a corner of the bar where a guy was sketching caricatures on napkins for tips. "Do us," she demanded, sliding a $10 bill across the counter. The artist raised an eyebrow but complied, his marker moving quickly over the paper as Delilah and I leaned into each other, both trying not to laugh. The result was ridiculous. Exaggerated features, wild hair, and my drink immortalized as a volcano erupting in my hand. She loved it, tucking the napkin carefully into her jacket like it was priceless art. We left the bar sometime after midnight, the air outside crisp and electric. She didn't ask where we were going, just grabbed my hand again and led me down a street lined with shuttered storefronts. We ended up at a park, the kind with a broken swing set and graffiti-covered benches. "Tell me something true," she said suddenly, sitting cross-legged on the ground like we were at summer camp. I hesitated, then told her about how I used to be afraid of mirrors as a kid, convinced they'd one day show me something that wasn't there. "That's not weird," she said, tilting her head like she was analyzing a painting. "It's human. We're all a little scared of ourselves." She offered up her own truth in return, admitting that she sometimes sabotaged her own art because the idea of finishing something terrified her more than failing. "I like beginnings," she said, her voice soft for the first time all night. "Endings are too permanent." The conversation wove in and out of seriousness, punctuated by bursts of laughter and half-hearted attempts to swing on the creaky set nearby. We were both drunk on more than just alcohol by the time we ended up at her place, a tiny studio apartment that smelled like cinnamon and paint. The night didn't turn into some cinematic whirlwind of passion. Instead, it felt intimate in a quieter way. We sat on her floor, flipping through her sketchbooks and making up stories for her unfinished drawings. When we finally kissed, it was almost an afterthought, like something we'd been meaning to get around to. I fell asleep on her couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like her perfume. The next morning, she was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and the same sharp grin from the night before. "You snore," she said, but there was no judgment in her tone. "And you steal matches," I replied, earning another one of those unguarded laughs. As I left her apartment, napkin caricature still tucked into my pocket, I couldn't help but wonder if this was one of those moments you replay later, trying to figure out its significance. Maybe it was just a single night, a random collision of two people who'd likely drift apart. Or maybe it was something else, a beginning, messy and uncertain but real. Delilah didn't text me first, and I wasn't sure if I was brave enough to break the silence. For a while, the night felt like a secret, something too fragile to share with the daylight. But every time I lit a candle at home, striking one of those stolen matches, I thought of her grin and the way she dared me to do something as simple as finish a drink. Eventually, I stopped waiting for the perfect moment and texted her, "Still stealing matches?" Her reply came almost immediately, "Always. Want to help me restock?" I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I wasn't scared of mirrors anymore. Let's start a new story. I was halfway through a bag of peanut M&Ms, sitting in my car on the side of an unfamiliar road, when it hit me that I might have made a series of terrible life choices. The kind you don't see unraveling until you're smack in the middle of them. wondering if you should laugh, cry, or just keep eating candy like that'll somehow fix things. It all started with a goat. Well, technically it started with my friend Luke, who had the kind of chaotic energy that turns every plan into an adventure or a disaster. Luke called me on a Sunday morning, asking if I'd help him move a goat he'd acquired to a farm he'd rented in the countryside. Why he needed a goat or a farm was a question I didn't ask because, frankly, it sounded like one of those stories that would be funny later. Spoiler alert, it wasn't funny at the time. I showed up at his apartment to find the goat, a small, wiry thing with an attitude, tethered to a kitchen chair. Luke had named her Clementine, which seemed overly optimistic for a goat that looked like it survived exclusively on spite and broken dreams. I gave him my best what the hell look, but he was already shoving a leash into my hands and insisting this was going to be easy. "She's a sweetheart," he said moments before Clementine headbutted the chair into a wall. Sweetheart, indeed. The plan was simple, in theory. Load Clementine into the back of his ancient minivan, drive 2 hours to the farm, and set her loose in a fenced pasture. The plan failed at step 1 because Clementine refused to get in the van. She planted her hooves and let out a noise that could only be described as an unholy mix of a scream and a laugh, like she knew exactly how screwed we were. Luke tried to bribe her with a handful of kale, but Clementine swatted it out of his hand with the kind of contempt that made me question my place on the food chain. Eventually, we managed to wrestle her into the van using a combination of sheer determination and questionable decision-making. I ended up in the back seat with her because Luke said, "She likes you." She did not like me. She spent most of the drive glaring at me like I was personally responsible for every bad thing that had ever happened to her. At one point, she tried to eat my jacket, and when I gently pushed her away, she retaliated by stepping on my foot. Hard. By the time we reached the farm, I was done. Done with Luke, done with goats, and definitely done with my M&M-less jacket. But then, as we pulled into the driveway, something shifted. The farm wasn't much, just a couple of acres, a rickety barn, and a field overgrown with wildflowers. But it had this quiet charm, like a place frozen in time. The sun was setting, casting everything in that soft, golden light you only see in postcards or daydreams. And in that moment, despite everything, it felt worth it. Clementine, of course, refused to leave the van. She'd spent the entire ride resisting us, only to decide that the back seat was her new home. After a lot of coaxing and one near miss involving her trying to climb over the front seat, we finally got her out. She trotted into the field like she owned the place, chewing on wildflowers and ignoring us entirely. Luke, sweaty and exhausted but somehow still grinning, clapped me on the back and said, "See? Easy." I wanted to throttle him, but instead I laughed. Because what else do you do when you've just spent your entire Sunday relocating a goat to a farm that doesn't even have Wi-Fi? We sat on the porch for a while, watching Clementine explore her new home. And as ridiculous as the day had been, there was something oddly satisfying about seeing her there, free to roam and, presumably, plot her next act of revenge. Luke was rambling about his grand plans for the farm. Chickens, a vegetable garden, maybe even bees, but I wasn't really listening. I was too busy thinking about how rarely I let myself do things like this. Things that don't make sense on paper, but end up making you feel more alive than any meticulously planned day ever could. Somewhere along the way, between the goat wrestling and the golden hour glow, I realized I didn't regret saying yes to Luke's chaotic plan. In fact, I was kind of grateful for it. It reminded me that life isn't just about being comfortable or efficient. Sometimes it's about saying yes to the weird, messy, unpredictable stuff. The stuff that makes for stories you'll laugh about later, even if they don't feel funny in the moment. So, here I am, a little wiser, a little bruised, and still kind of mad at Clementine for trying to eat my jacket. But also, weirdly, a little in awe of her. That goat didn't care about rules or plans or whether anyone liked her. She just existed unapologetically herself. And maybe there's something to be learned from that. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a situation so absurd you couldn't help but learn something from it? I'd love to hear your stories, especially if they involve goats. Or Jack. Let's start a new story. It hit me at the grocery store, of all places. I was standing in the snack aisle, staring at a bag of chips that claimed to taste like grilled cheeseburger with bacon. Not cheeseburger-flavored chips. Mind you, that would be too simple. No, these were grilled cheeseburger with bacon flavored. I don't know why that tiny detail broke me, but suddenly, the entire weight of modern absurdity came crashing down. I put the bag back on the shelf like I was holding a piece of cursed art and walked away, wondering how humanity had reached this point. Later that night, I gave in and Googled the chips. It turns out they're part of a trend where companies compete to make the most innovative flavors. There's even a whole online community that ranks them. People dissect the flavor accuracy with the same care a sommelier might describe a vintage wine. The bacon note is subtle, but builds on the palate with a satisfying smoky finish. I sat there, scrolling through pages of this, and realized I was genuinely impressed. Not by the chips, but by the fact that someone, somewhere, has turned tasting weird snacks into a legitimate passion. And for a moment, I felt like I was watching a tiny miracle unfold. This isn't an isolated experience for me. Lately, I've been noticing these tiny, ridiculous corners of modern life everywhere. Like how my inbox is a surreal mashup of automated corporate cheeriness and existential chaos. One email says, "It's National Pretzel Day. Celebrate with 20% off." The next is a grim reminder that I forgot to pay a bill. And wedged between them is an invitation to join a webinar about using AI to enhance mindfulness. Which, let's be honest, sounds like the setup for a dystopian novel. But the wild thing is I don't even question it anymore. This strange digital soup is just life now. Even the way we interact has become its own kind of theater. I don't know when it started, but every conversation I have with friends now feels like it's 80% memes, 15% GIFs, and maybe 5% actual words. Last week, someone sent me a TikTok of a raccoon dramatically eating a piece of bread, and I immediately knew it was their way of saying, "I'm stressed but surviving." It's like we've collectively created this bizarre visual shorthand for emotions too complicated or too exhausting to articulate. And honestly, it works. A meme about a pigeon aggressively refusing breadsticks communicates more than an hour-long therapy session ever could. Sometimes, though, I wonder if we're all secretly losing our grip on reality. The other day, I found myself apologizing to my phone. Not to a person on the other end of the line, just to the phone itself. I was trying to type a message, got frustrated when autocorrect kept changing definitely to defiantly, and muttered, "Sorry, I didn't mean to yell," to my phone, which is, by definition, an inanimate object. I sat there for a full minute afterward, wondering if I should be concerned. But instead of doing something productive, I took a screenshot of the failed autocorrect and sent it to a friend, who replied with an image of a bear face-palming. Modern solidarity. Speaking of solidarity, can we talk about the unspoken rules of online shopping? I recently bought a tiny cactus because it showed up as a recommended item while I was ordering toothpaste. I didn't need a cactus, but the algorithm somehow convinced me that I did. And now it's sitting on my desk like a tiny green friend who judges me every time I scroll Instagram instead of working. Side note, I've named it Carl. Carl the cactus, who will outlive us all. The other day, I caught myself whispering, "Don't look at me like that," when I opened TikTok instead of finishing an email. So now, not only am I apologizing to technology, but I'm also justifying my choices to a plant. Progress. And then there's the relentless march of smart devices. My fridge recently decided to notify me that I was running low on eggs. I didn't tell it I was running low on eggs. It just knew. It also suggested a recipe for frittata, which I found both helpful and deeply unsettling. I mean, where does it end? Am I supposed to consult my fridge for life advice now? Should I quit my job, Samsung? I imagine it responding with something cryptic like, "Don't forget to defrost your chicken." Thanks, I guess. But for all the absurdity, there's a strange kind of beauty in it too. Like how I can sit on my couch, order a single donut, and have it delivered to my door in under 30 minutes. Or how I can watch live footage of a space launch while also browsing videos of people power washing driveways. Or how my neighbor's 80-year-old mother now ends every text with LOL. Not because she's laughing, but because she thinks it stands for lots of love. I haven't had the heart to correct her. It's too pure. The truth is, modern life is a patchwork quilt of the bizarre and the brilliant. It's ridiculous, sure, but it's also full of these tiny, human moments that make it all worth it. Like the way my friends and I send each other random Amazon links for things we'd never buy, just to laugh at the reviews. This banana-shaped cat bed changed my life. One of them read, "I sleep better just knowing it exists." Or the way strangers on the internet will band together to solve the dumbest mysteries, like finding out why a town in Wyoming keeps getting random packages of rubber ducks. It's chaotic, but it's also kind of magical. So here we are, living in a world where we communicate through raccoon memes, have conversations with our fridges, and unapologetically buy cactus companions. It's weird, wonderful, and honestly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. What about you? What's the strangest little joy you've found in the chaos of modern life? Let's start a new story. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, one of those days where everything feels like background noise. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone with the enthusiasm of someone rifling through a junk drawer. My dog, Otis, was sprawled out at my feet, snoring softly like a tiny, furry foghorn. A half-empty mug of coffee sat on the table in front of me, cold and forgotten. It was the kind of day that blends into a dozen others, quiet, unremarkable, entirely predictable. And then the light hit my living room window at just the right angle, and I learned something that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. The window in question is nothing special. Standard apartment issue, framed in cheap white plastic, with a view of the parking lot and a distant highway. But as the afternoon sun slid lower, it hit the glass in a way I'd never noticed before. That's when I saw them. Faint, crisscrossing lines etched across the surface. They were so subtle, they almost disappeared if I tilted my head. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Was the glass scratched? Did someone vandalize my window? Why did it look like my apartment was inside a giant kaleidoscope? I leaned in closer, nose practically touching the glass, and that's when it clicked. These weren't scratches, they were patterns. Tiny, intricate ones, like spiderweb spun by a perfectionist arachnid with an eye for geometry. And they were everywhere, covering the entire pane. I had never noticed them before. Not once. I'd lived here for 3 years, past that window, every day, looked through it 100 times. How had I missed this? I pulled out my phone and Googled weird patterns on window glass. Side note, if you ever want to feel like a clueless child trying to explain a dream, type something vague like that into a search bar. It turns out those patterns are called stress marks. They happen when the glass is cooled unevenly during manufacturing. Basically, the window remembers the pressure it went through, like scars from the heat of its creation. The marks are always there, but they're invisible until the light hits them just right. I sat back, stunned. My window had a history. This plain, forgettable thing had endured something intense, and it carried the evidence quietly, unseen, until the right moment. And here I was thinking it was just a piece of glass. That thought stayed with me for hours, quietly shifting gears in my head. What else in my life was like this window? What else was quietly holding its stories, unnoticed because I hadn't looked at it in the right light? I started seeing stress marks everywhere. My coffee mug had faint scratches on the inside, evidence of every impatient spoon scrape as I stirred in sugar. My dog's favorite chew toy, worn smooth at the edges, held the invisible record of 1,000 happy hours. Even my hands, there's a scar on my left thumb from when I was 10 and thought it was a good idea to carve a pumpkin with a steak knife. That scar is my own stress mark, an echo of a moment I barely remember, but will carry with me forever. It felt profound, like the world had suddenly unfolded just a little, offering me a glimpse of something bigger. I couldn't stop thinking about how everything, every object, every person, every place carries these hidden stories. And most of the time, we're too busy, too distracted, too wrapped up in our own heads to notice. The next day, I told my coworker about the stress marks while we were waiting for the copier to warm up. I expected a polite nod, maybe a, that's interesting. Instead, she lit up. "Oh my God, you just reminded me of something," she said, pulling out her phone. She showed me a picture of a quilt her grandmother had made years ago. At first glance, it looked like a normal patchwork quilt. but she zoomed in to show me the stitches. They were uneven, almost jagged in places. She made this right after my grandpa died, my co-worker explained, her voice softening. She told me the stitches are messy because her hands were shaking the whole time, but she finished it anyway. I stared at the picture, overwhelmed. The stress marks of grief sewn into something warm and beautiful. It was all too much in the best possible way. Now every time I see those faint patterns on my window, I think about what the light reveals. How the unnoticed things, the scratches, the seams, the scars, carry stories we don't always see. And how, if we're lucky, we might catch them in the right light just for a moment. So I have to ask, have you ever noticed something small, so small it almost escaped you, and realized it carried a story you weren't expecting? Something hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the light to hit it right? I'd love to hear your stories. Let's start a new story. I'd never been to the tiny shop before, though I must have walked past it 100 times. It was squeezed between a laundromat and an old barber shop, the kind of place that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The sign above the door read, "The Odds and Ends Emporium," in flaking gold letters. I might not have noticed it at all if the bell hanging on the doorframe hadn't rung of its own accord as I walked by. No wind, no passerby brushing against it, just a sharp, clear ding. I stopped. Who wouldn't? The shop window was packed with a chaotic assortment of objects. Dusty snow globes, mismatched teacups, a birdcage with no door, and what looked like a chessboard missing half its pieces. None of it made sense. It was like someone had taken the contents of a dozen forgotten attics and mashed them together. Before I knew it, my hand was on the door, and I was stepping inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, lemon and cedar, like an old library had decided to host a garden party. The second thing was the sheer volume of stuff. Shelves stretched up to the ceiling, crowded with objects that defied categorization. An abacus, missing its beads, sat beside a jar of marbles. A violin bow with no violin rested atop a stack of books whose titles were in languages I didn't recognize. It was overwhelming and fascinating all at once. Looking for something? The voice startled me. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, knitting what looked like an impossibly long scarf. Her hair was piled on her head in a cloud of white curls, and her eyes twinkled with something between amusement and mischief. Just looking," I said, which felt ridiculous the moment the words left my mouth. "Looking for what? A broken clock? A single glove? Good," she said with a nod. "The best things find you when you're not looking." She didn't seem interested in further conversation, her needles clicking away as if they were doing most of the work on their own. I wandered through the aisles, my fingers brushing against objects without really knowing why. A compass that spun wildly no matter how I held it. A bottle labeled for growing impossible things, with liquid the color of a stormy sky. A clock with no hands, its face painted to look like a full moon. It felt less like browsing and more like dreaming. None of it made sense, but none of it felt random either. Then I saw the box. It was small, no larger than a jewelry box, made of dark wood with an intricate pattern carved into the lid. The carvings looked like waves, or maybe clouds. It was hard to tell. I picked it up, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The box was heavier than it looked, and when I opened it, I found a single key resting inside. It was simple, unremarkable, but something about it felt warm, alive, almost. "That one's been waiting a while," the woman said from behind me. I jumped. I hadn't heard her move. She stood a few feet away, her scarf trailing behind her like a river of yarn. Careful though, keys don't just open doors. Sometimes they close them too. "What does it open?" I asked, though part of me already knew she wouldn't answer. "It opens what it opens," she said with a shrug, as if that were the most obvious thing in the world. "If it's yours, you'll figure it out. If it's not, well..." She let the sentence hang, her eyes glinting like she knew something I didn't. I wanted to ask more, but before I could, she reached into her apron and pulled out a small slip of paper. "Take this too. No charge for either." I unfolded the paper to find a hand-drawn map. It wasn't detailed, just a series of winding lines leading to an X. "No labels, no landmarks. Where does this lead?" I asked. She smiled, The kind of smile that made you wonder if she was being kind or playing a trick. That depends on where you start. I left the shop before I could second-guess myself, the box and map tucked under my arm. Outside, the bell dinged again, and when I glanced back, the sign was gone. The odds and ends emporium had vanished, replaced by an empty storefront with dust-covered windows. Of course it had. The map didn't make sense at first. I studied it for hours that night, comparing it to Google Maps, sketching out possibilities, even holding it up to the light to see if there were hidden markings. Nothing. Frustrated, I tossed it onto the coffee table and went to bed. But when I woke up, the map had changed. The lines were sharper, more detailed, and there were tiny marks I hadn't seen before, little symbols like stars and crescent moons. The X glowed faintly, as if daring me to follow it. And so I did. The journey was strange, to say the least. The map seemed to adjust as I walked, leading me down streets I didn't recognize, through parks that felt too quiet, and past buildings that looked half-forgotten. At one point, I found myself in a courtyard surrounded by ivy-covered walls, where a single black cat sat in the center, staring at me like it knew a secret. When I tried to pet it, it darted away, but its tail flicked in the direction of a narrow alley. The map glowed brighter when I turned that way. Finally, I reached the X, a small, weathered door set into the side of a hill. It looked impossibly old, the wood splintered but sturdy, the handle worn smooth. The key in my pocket grew warm as I approached, and when I slid it into the lock, it turned with a satisfying click. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. I can't explain what I saw. Not really. It wasn't one place, it was every place. A kaleidoscope of shifting landscapes, from endless forests to glittering cities, from quiet meadows to skies filled with stars. And there, in the center of it all, stood the woman from the shop, her scarf now impossibly long, its threads shimmering like sunlight on water. "You'll find what you need," she said, her voice echoing as if it came from everywhere at once. "Just remember, every door you open changes the world behind you." And then the door closed behind me, leaving me in a world I'm still trying to understand. Let's start a new story. It happened on a Tuesday, which felt unfair because Tuesdays have no business being magical. I was standing in line at the post office, clutching a bubble mailer that contained absolutely nothing special, just some papers I needed to send for work. The line was longer than it had any right to be, and the fluorescent lights overhead were humming loud enough to make me question the structural integrity of my skull. That's when I noticed the woman ahead of me. She was older, early 80s, maybe, but she stood ramrod straight with the kind of poise you don't see much anymore. She wore a pale blue coat, one of those vintage numbers with a high collar and delicate stitching along the cuffs. Her hair was silver and neatly pinned up, like she'd taken time with it even though she was just mailing something. She didn't have a package or an envelope. In her hands was a single white rose. I didn't mean to stare, but it was hard not to. Who brings a rose to a post office? For a second, I thought maybe she was holding it for someone else, but no one around us seemed to know her. It felt like the kind of question you shouldn't ask, like staring too long at a mirage. Then she turned to me. "Can you hold this for a moment?" she asked, extending the rose toward me, like it was the most natural request in the world. Her voice was soft but steady, the kind of voice that made you want to listen. I nodded, dumbstruck, and reached out to take it. The moment I touched the stem, something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a light or anything dramatic. It was more like the air itself took a deep breath. I felt it in my chest, like a tiny pulse of warmth that spread outward. The woman smiled as if she'd expected this, then turned back toward the counter as the line shuffled forward. She left me standing there, holding the rose like it had been passed to me in some ancient ceremony. I glanced down at it, half expecting it to glow or hum or sprout wings. But no, it was just a rose. A perfect white rose, with soft petals and a faint, earthy scent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. It didn't just feel alive, it felt aware. The line moved again, and I watched as the woman reached the counter. She leaned in close to the postal worker and whispered something I couldn't hear. The worker, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, nodded slowly, his eyes widening just a little. He disappeared into the back and returned a moment later with a package. It wasn't a normal package, though. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, and stamped with what looked like dozens of strange, circular seals. The woman took it with both hands, cradling it like it was made of glass. She thanked him, then turned and walked past me without another word. She didn't take the rose back. I called after her. "Wait, you forgot this." She paused at the door and looked over her shoulder. "Oh, I didn't forget. It's yours now." And then she was gone, stepping out into the crisp autumn air and vanishing down the sidewalk like she'd been erased from the moment. I stared at the rose, my mind racing. What did she mean, "It's yours now"? Was this some kind of prank? But as I turned the stem in my fingers, I felt that same pulse again, faint but unmistakable, like the rose itself was alive in a way that defied explanation. The rest of the day was odd. It started small. The man behind me in line offered to pay for my shipping when I realized I'd left my wallet in the car. "Don't worry about it," he said, waving me off like it was nothing. When I thanked him, he just smiled and said, "You've got good energy today." I didn't know what to make of that. Later, on my drive home, I hit every green light. Every single one. In the city. On a Tuesday. At rush hour. I laughed out loud in the car, half joking to myself that the rose was some kind of talisman. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt true. That evening, I took the rose inside and placed it in a glass of water. It seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, though that might have been my imagination. I tried to go about my night as usual, making dinner, scrolling through my phone, but I kept finding reasons to glance at the rose. It felt like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint sound. It wasn't loud, more like the soft rustling of leaves. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a faint shimmer near the kitchen table where the rose sat. It wasn't a glow, exactly, more like the air itself was bending, rippling like water. I blinked, and the shimmer was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few days, the rose didn't wilt. If anything, it grew more vibrant, the petals practically glowing with life. And the little coincidences kept piling up. Lost keys reappearing in impossible places, strangers smiling at me like they knew some shared secret. A phone call from an old friend just when I needed it most. It was subtle, nothing you could point to as proof, but I felt it. The world around me had softened, like it was leaning in to whisper something only I could hear. A week later, the rose began to fade. Not wilting, exactly, just growing quieter, if that makes any sense. By the 10th day, it was gone entirely, the petals dissolving into the air as I watched. No miss, no drama. Just gone. I haven't seen the woman again, though sometimes I catch myself scanning crowds, wondering if she's out there, handing roses to other unsuspecting people. But the feeling she left me with, the sense that the world is far more alive, more connected, more magical than we usually notice, that hasn't faded. Have you ever felt like the world slipped something into your hands, just for a moment, to remind you that it's paying attention? Let's start a new story. When I first met Elena, I thought she was going to get me fired. Not in a deliberately sabotaging my work kind of way, but in a her mere existence might destroy my will-to-function professionally way. She was my new cubicle neighbor, and from the moment she walked in, I knew she was trouble. Not in a dramatic leather jacket and motorcycle sense. No, Elena's brand of trouble was the sort that radiated from her wild energy, her incessant humming, and her complete disregard for normal workplace behavior. On her first day, she walked in wearing bright yellow pants, a t-shirt with some obscure meme about frogs, and sneakers that squeaked loudly on the office floor. The sound was like a tiny, persistent dolphin call, echoing with every step. I turned to say hello, and before I could even finish introducing myself, she said, "Can you believe that vending machine doesn't have cheese puffs? It's barbaric." Then she plopped down at her desk and started unpacking what appeared to be an entire farmer's market worth of snacks. I tried to be polite, but she was a lot. She had this habit of singing pop songs under her breath, but only the chorus, on repeat, until your brain begged for mercy. She used her desk as an impromptu art studio, scattering paints, brushes, and glitter everywhere. Once, during a particularly stressful deadline, She rolled a yoga mat onto the floor and started meditating right there in the middle of the office. It wasn't even a quiet meditation. There were chants. At first, I avoided her like a cat dodging a bath. She was too chaotic, too weird, too much for my orderly little world. But she was impossible to ignore. Elena had a way of making herself known, like a rogue firework in the sky. She wasn't content with small talk, either. She asked questions that seemed ridiculous at first, but somehow stuck with you. If you could be any bird, what bird would you be? She asked me once. I laughed and brushed her off, but she pressed on. No, seriously, this is important. I think you'd be an owl. Thoughtful, kind of mysterious. I didn't know what to say, because who the hell describes their coworker as kind of mysterious? The day everything changed was a Wednesday. I remember because it was raining, and the office always felt extra dreary on rainy days. I was buried in spreadsheets, trying to fix a mess someone else had created, when Elena leaned over our cubicle divider and said, "You look like you need a break." Without waiting for an answer, she disappeared and came back a few minutes later holding two ridiculous hats, one shaped like a giant taco, the other like a pirate's tricorn. "Pick your fighter," she said, grinning like a kid with a secret. I should have ignored her. I should have told her to leave me alone. Instead, I grabbed the pirate hat and put it on without a word. She clapped her hands like she'd won the lottery, then pulled out her phone and said, "Okay, serious faces. We're going viral." Before I knew it, she'd taken a selfie of us looking ridiculous and emailed it to the entire office with the subject line, "Rainy Day Heroes." I expected people to roll their eyes. Instead, replies started pouring in. People were laughing, sharing their own silly photos, making jokes. For the first time, the office didn't feel like a gray box of misery. It felt fun, and it was because of her. After that, I couldn't keep pretending she was just the weird one. Slowly, I started letting her pull me into her world. She convinced me to go to karaoke night. Not just to watch, but to sing, which is something I hadn't done since a traumatic middle school talent show. She taught me how to make origami cranes during lunch breaks. Once, she made me try something called donut meditation, which is exactly what it sounds like, eating a donut while thinking deeply about how lucky you are to have a donut. It was absurd and wonderful. The thing about Elena was that she didn't just exist. She lived. She noticed things other people ignored, like how Karen from HR always wore purple on Tuesdays, or how the coffee machine made a little pop sound right before spitting out your cup. She celebrated the mundane as if it were extraordinary, and somewhere along the way, she taught me to do the same. One day, months after that first rainy Wednesday, she showed up at my desk with a tiny cactus in a pink ceramic pot. "For you," she said, plopping it down with no explanation. When I asked why, she shrugged and said, "You seemed like someone who needed a cactus." It was such a ridiculous Elena thing to say, but the way she said it made my chest feel tight in the best way. I think I knew then in that moment that I was in trouble. Real trouble. Not because she was chaotic or too much, but because I'd fallen completely, helplessly for her. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone at first? Let's start a new story. It was fluttering on the sidewalk, caught in the grip of a stray breeze. I might not have noticed it if the corner hadn't snagged on my shoe. The paper light, but persistent. When I picked it up, the image was blurry from age, a lighthouse perched on a jagged cliff, waves crashing below. The back was worse, smudged by what looked like coffee stains and time. But one line of the handwritten text stood out, unmistakable. "Meet me where the sky touches the sea." I should have ignored it, but there was something about the message, its audacity, its romance, that I couldn't shake. I tucked it into my pocket and spent the day in a distracted haze. By evening, it felt like the card was burning through my coat. I pulled it out again while waiting for the train home, tracing the faded ink with my thumb. I wasn't sure why, but I decided I was going. 2 days later, I was on a bus heading toward the coast. I didn't know where I was going exactly. There were dozens of lighthouses along that stretch of shore, but the air seemed to push me forward. I got off at a stop that felt right, a nameless road lined with wildflowers and sand. The ocean roared in the distance, and for a moment I felt ridiculous. Was I really chasing a cryptic message on a random piece of paper? But then I saw it, the lighthouse from the postcard, standing defiant against the horizon. When I reached it, I found the door ajar, its heavy wood creaking with the wind. Inside, the air smelled of salt and iron, and a spiral staircase wound upward into the tower. I climbed slowly, the postcard crumpled in my hand. At the top was a room that felt impossibly alive. Shelves crammed with books, jars of strange objects, sea glass, feathers, even a tiny clock that ticked erratically, and a small table with a steaming teapot as if someone had just been there. And they had. A man was sitting by the window, facing the sea. His silhouette was sharp against the light, but when he turned, his face was open and kind, with a mischievous gleam in his eyes. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "You found the card," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He gestured toward the other chair. "See?" I should have asked who he was or what this was about, but the question stuck in my throat. Something about his presence felt steady, like he'd been waiting for me my entire life. He said, "For hours we talked. Or rather, he talked and I listened. He told me stories, the kind you'd expect from a sailor or an explorer. Treasure maps that led to forgotten caves, storms that ripped the world apart and stitched it back together, strange encounters with strangers who spoke languages older than the wind. He had a way of speaking that made you feel like you were there, tasting the salt air and hearing the creak of the ship's hull. At some point, he pulled out a small music box. It was battered, its paint peeling, but when he opened it, the melody that played was hauntingly beautiful. It was a song I couldn't place but felt like I had always known, something stitched into the fabric of my memory. "You're not here by accident," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "The world has edges you haven't seen yet, places where things don't work the way you expect. You can step into them if you're willing to follow the music." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words stuck. He stood, handed me the music box. "Keep this," he said. "It'll show you the way when you're ready." And then he was gone. I don't mean he left the room. I mean one moment he was standing there, and the next the chair was empty. The teapot was cold. The only thing left was the music box in my hands, still playing its impossible song. I left the lighthouse in a daze, clutching the music box like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The sky had shifted while I was inside, the stars impossibly close and bright. The walk back to the bus stop felt surreal, the world around me humming with an energy I couldn't describe. Back home, I tried to return to my routine, but everything felt dull. The music box sat on my desk, silent, until one night, months later, it began to play on its own. The melody was different this time, more urgent, and I knew what it was asking. I packed a bag and set out again, this time with no idea where I was going. The world feels different now, as if I've slipped into one of those edges he spoke of. The air is thicker, the colors sharper, and sometimes I hear the melody from the box in places it shouldn't be, whistling through the trees or echoing off a distant hill. I don't know what I'm looking for, but I know I'm closer than I've ever been. Have you ever felt like something or someone was calling you to a world just outside the edges of this one? Like there's a secret waiting for you, hidden in plain sight? Would you follow the music? Let's start a new story. I'd been sitting at the corner of the cafe, my favorite spot because it gave me a clear view of the door and an excuse to face away from everyone else. The mug of chai I'd ordered was still too hot to sip, so I was stirring it absent-mindedly, lost in my thoughts, when I heard the clatter. He was standing near the counter, a tall, wiry guy in a plaid shirt, staring down at the brown puddle spreading across the floor like it had personally betrayed him. The barista handed him a wad of napkins with the kind of resignation that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with a customer too clumsy for his own good. He crouched to clean up, and that's when he saw me watching. "Great first impression, right?" he said, standing awkwardly with soggy napkins in his hands. There was something so self-deprecating in his tone that I couldn't help but smile. "Hey, at least you didn't spill it on someone," I replied. "That would have been worse." "True," he said, and then, as if he just thought of it, added, "though that might have been a good excuse to meet someone interesting." I raised an eyebrow, a bold move, and one that could have gone wrong in so many ways. But instead of sounding smarmy, he came off as genuinely curious. He smiled, a little sheepishly, and I realized he was waiting for a response. "Well," I said, nodding at the mop the barista had retrieved. Maybe next time aim for someone who doesn't look like they're still waking up. He laughed, an actual, full-on laugh that drew a few glances from the other patrons. Fair enough, he said. I'll aim for someone holding a napkin dispenser next time. He gestured toward the empty seat across from me. Mind if I sit? Promise I won't spill anything else. This was the point where I should have declined. I had come here specifically to avoid interactions like this, to enjoy a quiet afternoon with my book and my chai. But there was something disarming about him, an unpolished earnestness that made him feel less like a stranger and more like someone I might already know. Sure, I said, surprising myself. He sat down, sliding his drink, a replacement, presumably, onto the table. I'm Adam, he said. Kate, I replied, watching as he leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. But then I noticed his hand fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve, a subtle giveaway that he wasn't as at ease as he wanted to appear. So, he began, do you come here often? Or is this one of those times where I've just ruined your secret spot forever? I laughed, and it felt natural, unforced. More the latter, I admitted. But it's fine. I was getting bored of this place anyway. Liar, he said, pointing at the well-worn book next to my mug. That's the look of someone who's practically moved in. Let me guess. You're one of those people who claims they need the ambient noise to focus, but actually just likes eavesdropping on people's conversations. I pretended to look offended. I'll have you know, I've never eavesdropped in my life. I prefer the term accidental listener. Sure, he said, grinning. So what's the most interesting thing you've accidentally heard here? I thought for a moment, then decided to play along. Once, a guy came in and started explaining to his friend why he thought raccoons would make great pets. He had this whole PowerPoint presentation printed out, complete with statistics about their climbing abilities and trainability. Adam's eyebrows shot up. Did the friend agree? No idea, I said. The guy knocked over his coffee before he could finish. The corners of Adam's mouth twitched. Touché, he said, holding up his cup in mock surrender. For the next hour, we talked about everything and nothing. Books we hated but couldn't stop reading, the weirdest foods we'd ever tried, how he'd accidentally ended up volunteering at a goat farm one summer. It was like slipping into a conversation midstream, effortless in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Eventually, the cafe started to empty, and the staff began their end-of-day cleanup. Adam glanced at the time and grimaced. I should probably let you get back to your actual day, he said, though he didn't seem eager to leave. Probably. I agreed, but neither of us moved. Finally, he leaned forward, his expression shifting from playful to serious. Look, I don't want to make this weird, but would you want to grab a coffee again sometime? Or tea? Or whatever it is you're drinking? I hesitated, caught off guard by how much I wanted to say yes. Usually, these encounters left me feeling boxed in, pressured to navigate someone else's expectations. But with Adam, it felt different, like saying yes wouldn't cost me anything I wasn't already willing to give. Okay, I said, and his face lit up. As he scribbled his number on a napkin, I realized something that surprised me. The spill wasn't the beginning of the story. It was just the excuse. Let's start a new story. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in bed. At first, I thought I might still be dreaming, because the world around me was glowing. Not brightly, not in a way that hurt my eyes, but softly, as though everything had been dusted with a gentle, shimmering light. I blinked and sat up. The surface beneath me was warm and smooth, like polished stone that had been kissed by the sun. And then I saw it. The sky wasn't above me. It was below. I was sitting on a vast, inverted world. Mountains stretched upward into a golden void where clouds should have been. Rivers sparkled as they flowed toward the heavens. The trees, if you could call them that, were upside down, their roots twisting gracefully in the air like dancers mid-leap, while their branches dug deeply into the ground beneath my feet. Everything felt familiar and impossibly strange, like I'd stepped into a version of reality flipped inside out. My hand brushed something soft. Looking down, I realized I wasn't alone. Nestled beside me was a creature I couldn't immediately place. It had the fluffiness of a cat, the expressive eyes of a fox, and wings that shimmered with colors that didn't seem to belong to any spectrum I'd ever seen. It blinked at me, unbothered by my presence, and stretched lazily before sitting upright. "About time you woke up," it said in a voice that was neither male nor female, neither deep nor high-pitched, but something else entirely, like music layered over words. I yelped, scrambling backward. "You talk." The creature yawned, revealing rows of teeth that looked oddly polite. "Of course I do. Would be rude if I didn't. You got questions, I assume?" I nodded, still trying to comprehend what was happening. Where am I?" It tilted its head. "You're in the in-between." "The what?" "The in-between," it repeated, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You know, the space between where you've been and where you're going. It's not a place for staying, really, but it's nice, isn't it?" I looked around. "I guess? But how did I get here?" The creature flicked its tail, which left a trail of glittering light in the air. "Everyone ends up here eventually. Usually not on purpose, though. But you're an odd one. Fell right in, like a pebble in a pond." It stood and began to walk away on impossibly delicate feet, its wings twitching slightly. I hesitated but decided to follow. The ground underfoot felt alive, like it pulsed faintly with energy. As we walked, the scenery shifted, not gradually like clouds moving, but suddenly like someone flipping pages in a book. One moment we were in a meadow filled with flowers that hummed faint, cheerful melodies, and the next we were walking along the edge of a cliff that overlooked an ocean made entirely of light. "Do you want to go back?" the creature asked, its voice oddly casual. I blinked. "Back where? Wherever you came from. You're before." I don't even remember falling asleep," I admitted. "I don't know how I got here." It stopped and turned to face me, its eyes narrowing with playful curiosity. "That wasn't the question. I asked if you want to go back." I hesitated. "I think so. My life's not perfect, but it's mine. This place is amazing, but it's not real." The creature snorted, a sound like a tiny gust of wind. "Not real? And what makes your before so much more real than this? Is it because you can't explain it? Because it's not what you're used to? Reality is a lot slipperier than you think." As if to prove a point, it spread its wings and leapt into the air, spinning once before landing lightly on my shoulder. "But I like you," it continued. "You're curious, and curiosity deserves a reward." Before I could respond, the ground beneath us shifted again, and suddenly we were in what looked like a massive library. Except the books weren't made of paper. They floated midair, their covers glowing faintly, and their pages appeared to be alive, shifting and rearranging themselves as though they were constantly rewriting their own stories. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice a hushed whisper. "Stories," the creature said simply. "Every possibility, every choice, every thought anyone's ever had. They all end up here. Some are finished. Most aren't." It flicked its tail again, and one of the books floated down toward me. It opened itself in front of my face, revealing a scene I recognized instantly. Me, as a child, sitting in a treehouse I hadn't thought about in years, scribbling in a notebook with a pencil I kept chewing on. I felt a pang of nostalgia, so sharp it nearly knocked the breath out of me. "This one's yours," the creature said. "Or, well, one of yours. You're a complicated little human. Lots of branching paths. Can I read it?" "You could," it said with a shrug. "But where's the fun in knowing the ending before you've lived it?" I looked at the book, then back at the creature. "You said this isn't a place for staying. So what happens now?" Its wings shimmered again as it leapt off my shoulder and onto one of the glowing shelves. "That depends. You can wander a while longer. Take in the sights, peek at the stories, meet some interesting characters. Or you can go back. It's up to you." "How do I decide?" It grinned, a slow, mischievous smile that somehow felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. "Ah, but that's the fun part. Decisions make themselves. In the end, you'll know when you know." And just like that, it flicked its tail once more, and the world began to fade around me, the glowing library dissolving into stars. I felt a pull like a tether winding back into place, and then, just like that, I woke up. In my bed. In my before. Except, not everything was the same. On my nightstand, where my alarm clock should have been, there was a single shimmering feather, radiating a soft, golden light. So, if you ended up in the in-between, let's start a new story. There's a park near my apartment I walk through almost every day, the kind of green space that feels more like a hallway between errands than an actual destination. The paths are lined with those weirdly aggressive geese that act like they've paid rent, and there's a half-broken fountain that leaks just enough to form a permanent puddle beneath it. It's a place that doesn't try too hard, which I've always appreciated. But last summer, something happened there that still makes me wonder if the universe has a sense of humor. I was walking home from work, headphones in, mind firmly on autopilot, when I noticed a man up ahead standing perfectly still. He was staring at a tree like it had just told him a life-altering secret. Curious and nosy, I slowed down as I approached. He didn't notice me, which was fine, because I was fully committed to pretending I wasn't noticing him either. As I got closer, I saw what he was staring at, a tiny bird perched on a branch, a robin or something similar. The man was holding out a piece of what looked like a granola bar, as if he was trying to bribe the bird into landing on his hand. I couldn't help it. I stopped walking and just watched. Now, here's the thing about this guy. He didn't look like the kind of person who befriends birds. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my rent, and his hair was so perfectly combed it might have been aerodynamic. He looked like he should have been in a boardroom somewhere yelling things like synergy. Instead, he was standing there in the middle of a park, whispering to a bird like Snow White's overly ambitious cousin. Finally, I couldn't hold it in. "Are you trying to summon it?" I asked, pulling out one earbud. The guy jumped, clearly not expecting to have an audience. "What? No. I mean, yes, kind of." He looked embarrassed, but didn't lower the granola bar. "I saw someone do this once. Thought I'd try it." "Well," I said, leaning against a nearby tree. "How's it going?" He sighed. "Not great. I've been standing here for 15 minutes. This bird hates me." I laughed, and to my surprise, he laughed too. It was a nice laugh, the kind that makes you want to keep the conversation going. "Maybe you're offering the wrong snack," I said. "Birds are pretty picky." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? And you're a bird expert now?" I shrugged. "No, but I did watch a pigeon steal a bagel once. They're clearly connoisseurs." The bird, oblivious to our banter, suddenly took off, disappearing into the trees. The man groaned like he'd just been stood up on a first date. Figures. My only chance at a Disney moment, and I blew it. "Maybe it's for the best," I said. "If a bird actually landed on your hand, you'd probably freak out. Those claws are sharp." He laughed again, shaking his head. You're probably right." I'd scream and ruin the whole mystique. We ended up walking in the same direction, falling in a step like we'd been doing it for years. He told me his name was Ethan and that he worked in finance, which, judging by the suit, wasn't surprising. What was surprising was how unstuffy he was. He talked about how he used to come to this park as a kid, back when the fountain actually worked and the geese were slightly less terrifying. I told him about the time a goose chased me into a bush because I got too close to its babies. We both laughed until people stared. When we reached the edge of the park, Ethan hesitated. "Well," he said, "thanks for the commentary. Made me feel slightly less ridiculous." "Happy to help," I said. "And hey, next time try bread. Birds love bread." He smiled, one of those genuine, lopsided smiles that people don't give out easily. "I'll keep that in mind." And then he was gone, disappearing into the sea of suits and briefcases like he'd never been there at all. For a few seconds, I stood there, staring at the empty spot where he'd been, half expecting him to come back and say something else. He didn't. I walked home thinking about how weird life can be, how you can share a moment with a stranger that feels like it should matter, even though it doesn't really. I never saw Ethan again, but every time I passed that tree, I looked for the bird. I've even started carrying a granola bar in my bag, just in case. The lesson? I don't know if there is one. Maybe it's about how the smallest things, like a bird that doesn't want your snack, can make a day feel brighter. Or maybe it's just a reminder to pay attention. You never know when the universe might toss you a strange little gift, wrapped in granola crumbs and awkward conversations. So now I'm wondering, what's your version of this? Have you ever had a fleeting moment with a stranger that felt oddly significant? I'd love to hear about it. After all, we all need a little more magic in our everyday.